She didn't hear him knock. She heard the door open. And when Evelyn Marlowe looked up from her sewing table, a stranger trailed dusted, broad-shouldered, with the kind of eyes that had seen too many sunrises alone, was already standing inside her shop, holding his hat in both hands, like a man preparing for a sentence, not a conversation. He said 4 words that stopped her breath cold. "Your sister sent me." Evelyn set down her scissors, slowly, the way a woman sets something down when she needs her hands free. She said, "You needed a husband." The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that lives in the half-second before a woman decides whether to scream or laugh, and Evelyn Marlowe had never been the screaming kind. If you've ever had someone make a decision about your life without asking you first, if you've ever loved someone who still managed to make you feel like a problem to be solved, then you already know exactly what Evelyn felt standing in that doorway moment. And you're going to want to stay for every single word of what comes next. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city or country in the comments below. I read every single one, and I want to see just how far this story travels. Every like, every comment tells me you want more stories like this one. Don't go anywhere because this is only the beginning. Evelyn Marlowe had learned, through considerable personal experience, that the worst things in life rarely announce themselves loudly. They didn't crash through windows or arrive during thunderstorms. They came quietly. They came on ordinary afternoons, wrapped in familiar packaging, delivered by people who believed they were helping. That Tuesday was like any other Tuesday, the kind of day that doesn't deserve to be remembered. She had been at her sewing table since before sunrise, which was nothing unusual. The dress she was working on, a dark green wool piece ordered by Margaret Holt, wife of the mill foreman, required precise pleating at the waistline. And precise pleating required light and patience, and the particular kind of focus that only came when the shop was empty. Before the miners' wives arrived, before the children pressed their noses against the glass, before Red Willow woke up entirely and decided it needed something from her. The shop was her favorite version of the world. 800 square feet of order in a town that was still figuring out what it wanted to be. Bolts of fabric lined the left wall, from floor-to-ceiling calicos and wools, and a small selection of silks she kept for the women who had married well but lived far from anywhere that sold beautiful things. Her work table occupied the center of the room. The 2 fitting mirrors she'd hauled from Denver in a rented wagon stood at the far end, slightly scuffed at the bases, reflecting afternoon light in the way that made even plain women feel like something worth looking at. She'd built all of it herself. Not with her hands, though she'd done plenty of that too, but with 3 years of 7-day weeks and the kind of stubborn refusal to fail that people sometimes mistook for confidence. It wasn't confidence, not entirely. It was more like the momentum of someone who has already burned down the life behind her and has nowhere to go but forward. The bell above the door rang at 2:10. Evelyn didn't look up. She assumed it was Clara Pettigrew, who always came in on Tuesdays to browse without buying and ask questions about fabrics she couldn't afford. Clara was harmless and a little lonesome, and Evelyn had learned to answer her questions while continuing to sew. "Just a moment," she said. Nobody answered. That was unusual enough to make her glance toward the door. The man standing there was not Clara Pettigrew. He was somewhere in his mid-30s. Evelyn guessed, though men who worked outdoors all their lives had a way of looking both older and younger than they were, worn around the edges but solid underneath. He was tall, not dramatically tall, but the kind of tall that made a room feel slightly smaller. His jacket was canvas, heavy-duty, the kind designed to outlast fashion by several decades. His boots were trail boots, not show boots. His hat dark brown, wide-brimmed, shaped by actual weather, rather than a shop display, was currently being held in both his hands in front of his chest. He was holding it the way men held hats when they were bracing for something. He looked, Evelyn thought, like a man who had rehearsed this moment several times and still wasn't sure he'd gotten it right. "Mrs. Marlowe," he said. "Miss," she corrected automatically. Then she put her needle down. "Can I help you?" "I hope so," he said. He didn't move from the doorway. "My name is Silas Mercer. I've come from back east." He paused. "From your sister's house, actually." Evelyn felt something shift in her chest, not a pleasant shifting. "Louisa," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "She sent you." "She did." Evelyn waited. She was good at waiting. She'd learned that silence made people say more than they intended to, and she wanted to hear every word of whatever this was before she decided how angry to be. Silas Mercer looked at her steadily. He had the kind of eyes that didn't flinch, which she noticed because most people flinched when Evelyn looked at them a certain way. She had been told her, looking a certain way was somewhat alarming. She considered this a feature. She said, "You needed a husband," he said. The words were so plain, so matter-of-fact. No softening, no preamble. He said them the way you'd report the weather or the price of lumber. Evelyn picked up her needle again. She looked back at the green wool on her table. She made 2 careful stitches. Then she set the needle down again, because her hands were not as steady as she wanted them to be, and precision work required steady hands. "My sister," she said, "is a loving woman with an overactive imagination and approximately 0 understanding of my life. She mentioned you might say something like that." "Did she also mention," Evelyn said, "that I have been running this business alone for 3 years without any difficulty that required importing a man from the East to solve?" "She mentioned that too, and she sent you anyway." "She did, and you came." Silas Mercer looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't apologetic. It wasn't arrogant. It was something quieter than either of those things. "I did," he said, "though I want to be honest with you about why, because I don't think your sister's version is exactly the same as mine." That caught her off guard. She hadn't expected honesty. She'd expected charm or fumbling or the particular brand of confidence that certain men wore like a second skin when they were trying to make a woman feel grateful for their attention. "Close the door," she said. "You're letting in the cold." He closed the door. He didn't sit down. She hadn't offered him a chair, and he apparently understood the distinction. He stood near the entrance with his hat in his hands, and Evelyn stayed behind her work table, and there was enough space between them to conduct a conversation without either of them having to pretend it was something comfortable. "Talk," she said. Silas Mercer took a breath, not the theatrical kind. The practical kind, like a man organizing his thoughts before he wastes anybody's time. "I've been working ranches for 14 years, he said. "Other men's ranches. I'm good at it, the horses, the land management, the logistics. I've never had trouble finding work." He paused. "But I'm 36 years old, and I've spent my whole life building other men's things. I've got enough saved now to buy land of my own, start something of my own." "That's a fine ambition," Evelyn said carefully. "I fail to see what it has to do with me." "Your sister told me about you," he said. "Not in a scheming way, at least. Not entirely. She talked about you the way people talk about someone they admire but can't quite understand. She said you left everything comfortable, came out here alone, built a business from nothing, and that you help families who can't always pay you back." Something tightened in Evelyn's jaw. She also said, Silas continued, that most evenings you close up this shop and go home to an empty house, and that you've been telling yourself for 3 years that you prefer it that way. Quiet. Outside, someone was driving a cart past on the main road. The wheels needed greasing. She could hear them complaining from 40 yards away. "You traveled nearly 2,000 miles, Evelyn said, based on something my sister told you about me at a dinner table." "Yes, that is either very brave or very foolish." "Probably both," Silas said. "I won't argue the point." Evelyn studied him. He didn't look away. He also didn't perform any of the usual theater, the leaning, the smiling, the calculated charm that men sometimes deployed when they thought a woman needed coaxing. He just stood there, honest and inconvenient, waiting for her to make up her mind. "You understand," she said slowly, "that even if everything my sister told you is accurate, which I'm not confirming, I am not a package waiting to be collected. I am not a problem she gets to solve by mailing me a husband. I know that, he said. I told her as much before I left. Then why come at all? He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was different, lower, more careful. Because I've spent 14 years being practical, he said. And your sister described a woman who seemed worth the risk of being impractical for once. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the green wool on her table. The pleating was nearly done. Margaret Holt would be pleased. You need a place to stay, she said. I'll find something. Mrs. Calloway runs the boarding house on the north end of Maine. It's clean, the meals are adequate, and she won't ask you too many questions as long as you pay in advance. Evelyn picked up her needle. You can stay in Red Willow. I won't run you off. But I am not promising you a single thing, Mr. Mercer. Not one thing. I'm not asking for promises, Silas said. Good, because you won't get them. He nodded once, a short, clean nod. He put his hat back on, not jamming it, just placing it, with the practiced ease of someone who'd been putting on the same hat for years. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and set something on the small table near the door. A letter, sealed with Louisa's handwriting on the outside. She asked me to give you that, he said. I didn't read it. Of course you didn't, Evelyn said. I'll find Mrs. Calloway's boarding house, Silas said. Thank you for your time, Miss Marlowe. He opened the door. The cold came in briefly, sharp-edged and certain. Then he was gone, and the bell above the door rang once, and the shop was quiet again. Evelyn sat without moving for approximately 40 seconds. Then she got up, walked to the door, picked up Louisa's letter, and carried it to the back room where she kept her kettle and her tea and the small chair she sat in when she needed to think without anyone watching. She did not open the letter. She set it on the shelf above the kettle and looked at it for a while. The thing nobody tells you about building a life alone is that the building is the easy part. Evelyn had understood, even before she left everything behind and came west, that the work itself wouldn't break her. She'd always been good with her hands, good with numbers, good with the specific social calculations involved in making people feel respected without making them feel entitled to more than they'd paid for. She knew how to manage difficult customers and slow supply deliveries, and the particular exhaustion of being the only person responsible for every decision that affected your survival. What she hadn't expected was the other thing, not loneliness exactly. She didn't feel lonely during the day. During the day, she was too busy, too needed, too absorbed in the constant problem of running a small business in a growing town that still wasn't entirely sure it was going to survive. It was the evenings, not all of them. But the specific evenings when something good had happened, when a dress came together exactly right, or she'd managed to help a mining family get through a hard month without embarrassing them, and she went home to tell nobody about it. That was the part she'd gotten better at ignoring. She was extremely good at ignoring things that didn't serve any useful purpose. The letter stayed on the shelf above the kettle for 3 days. She was aware of it the entire time. She was also aware that being aware of it was exactly the kind of thing Louisa would find satisfying, which made Evelyn more determined to treat it with casual indifference. On the 4th morning, she opened it. Evie, I know what you're thinking. I know because I know you, which is exactly why I did what I did. So before you crumple this up and throw it in the fire, at least hear me out. I am not trying to manage your life. I'm not trying to fix you. You're not broken. You never have been. You are the most capable person I have ever known, and I am not saying that to flatter you into cooperating with me. But Evie, and I'm saying this as someone who loves you more than you've ever let yourself believe being capable is not the same as being whole. You know that. I think somewhere under all that wonderful stubbornness, you know that. Silas is a good man, a real one. I'm not sending you a solution. I'm sending you a possibility. What you do with it is, as always, entirely yours. Love, Lou. P.S. If you're rude to him, I will be genuinely disappointed. Though I expect you were rude to him, you're always rude to people who surprise you. Evelyn read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the drawer of her work table where she kept things she hadn't decided what to do with yet. She picked up her needle. She thought about the way Silas Mercer had held his hat. Red Willow was not a large town, which meant that everyone knew everyone's business, whether or not anyone had agreed to share it. By Thursday, 2 days after Silas had walked into her shop, Evelyn had already heard 3 different versions of who he was and why he'd come. Ruth Bauer at the general store told her version to anyone buying flour, which was nearly everyone. According to Ruth, the stranger at the boarding house had ridden all the way from Ohio in pursuit of a woman who'd refused to marry him back east, and he'd tracked her down to Red Willow like some kind of romantic lunatic. Old Pete from the livery had a different take. He'd talked to Silas directly. Silas had apparently stopped in to check on his horse's left front shoe and reported that the man was here to buy land. "Quiet type," Pete said. "Knows his horses, that's more than I can say for most." The third version came from Clara Pettigrew on her Tuesday visit, who had somehow connected all available information into a narrative involving Evelyn's sister, a secret engagement, an unspecified heartbreak, none of which had any grounding in reality. Evelyn corrected none of these versions. What she noticed, however, and she noticed it with the precise involuntary attention of someone trying very hard not to notice something, was that Silas Mercer did not come back to her shop. He'd said he would find work. He had. He'd taken a position at Harkin's lumber operation east of town, which was how Pete at the livery knew about his horsemanship, because Harkin's men boarded their animals there. He showed up each morning before sunrise and left each evening with the other workers. He ate at the boarding house. He was polite to everyone and personal with nobody. He did not seek her out. She'd told him she wasn't promising him anything, and apparently he'd taken that at face value. She told herself this was exactly what she'd wanted. She also told herself the feeling in her stomach when she realized he hadn't come back was simple annoyance at having anticipated something she'd claimed not to want. On Friday afternoon, she was walking back from the mill she'd gone to settle an account with Harold Holt when she nearly walked directly into Silas Mercer coming around the corner of the feed store. They both stopped. He looked, she thought, like he'd been working, which made sense because he had been. There was sawdust on his jacket and a tiredness around his eyes that wasn't the pathetic kind, but the honest kind, the kind that came from having used yourself well all day. "Miss Marlowe," he said. He didn't seem surprised to see her. Or if he was better at hiding it than most. "Mr. Mercer, how are you?" "Fine," she said. "You?" "Good," he said. "Work's steady. The crew at Harkin's are decent men." "Good," she said. They stood on the wooden sidewalk in the October cold with people moving around them in both directions, and the awkward thing about the moment was that neither of them moved to end it. They just stood there, 2 people who technically had very little reason to continue this conversation and were continuing it anyway. "You never told me," she said finally, because she was Evelyn Marlowe, and she had never in her life been comfortable with unfinished thoughts. "What exactly my sister said about me. The specific parts that made you think it was worth crossing most of the country." Silas considered this. He wasn't a man who answered fast to avoid silence. She'd noticed that in the shop. He thought first, then spoke, which was rarer than it should have been. She said, "You take in alterations for the miners' wives at half price and tell them it's a seasonal discount," he said. She said you did it because one of them cried in your shop once, and you couldn't think of another way to help that wouldn't make her feel ashamed. Evelyn said nothing. She said you haven't been back east in 3 years even though you miss her, because you think going back would look like admitting you couldn't make it out here work. Louisa Evelyn said, "Talks too much. She loves you," he said. Simply, not as an argument, just as a fact he happened to know. The wind moved down the main road, picking up dust and dead leaves and the distant smell of pine smoke from someone's chimney. Evelyn pulled her coat tighter. "There's a land parcel I'm going to look at Saturday," Silas said. "Northeast of town, the Garfield place, you know it?" "Garfield abandoned it 4 years ago," she said. "Soil's good in the lower fields." The upper pasture has water access problems. That's what I was told. He looked at her. Would you be willing to come look at it? You know this land better than I do. I'd value an honest opinion. It was, she thought, a very careful invitation. It wasn't a request for company. It was a request for expertise, which was a different thing entirely, and both of them knew the difference. Saturday, she said. Morning. I have a fitting at 2. Morning works fine, Silas said. He nodded, touched the brim of his hat the way men did in this part of the world when they were being respectful rather than performative, and walked on down the road toward the boarding house. Evelyn watched him go for exactly 2 seconds. Then she turned and walked back toward her shop, and she told herself the entire way home that this was a practical decision made for practical reasons, and there was nothing more to it than that. She almost believed it. That night she took Louisa's letter out of the drawer and read it a 3rd time. Being capable is not the same as being whole. She refolded it along the same creases and put it back. She sat in her kitchen for a while in the dark, with just the small lamp on the table between her and the window, and she thought about the word whole. What it meant. Whether she believed it was something she was missing, or simply something Louisa believed she was missing, which were very different problems. She was 32 years old. She had a business, a reputation, a community that respected her. She had freedom, real freedom, the kind that didn't depend on anyone else's moods or decisions or continued presence in her life. She thought about the half-price alterations. She thought about the way Mrs. Patterson's hands had shaken when she'd tried to pay full price for a dress she desperately needed for her daughter's church performance, and the way Evelyn had invented the seasonal discount on the spot without even thinking about it, just to save that woman the pain of accepting charity. She hadn't told anyone about that, not once. Louisa had found out anyway. Evelyn pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and sat in the dark kitchen for a long time, thinking about what it meant that a man she'd met 4 days ago already knew something about her that most people in Red Willow did not. She didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't sure she wanted one yet. Outside, the wind moved across the plains and the stars were very bright and very cold and very far away. And Evelyn Marlowe sat alone at her kitchen table, the way she had sat alone at her kitchen table for 3 years, and for the first time, that word alone landed differently in her chest. Not as a boast, not quite as a comfort either, just as a fact, waiting to see what she'd do with it. The Garfield land sat about 3 miles northeast of Red Willow, far enough from town that the noise dropped away, and you could hear individual things again, a hawk moving somewhere above the tree line. The particular sound frozen grass made, when the wind pushed across it, the way silence in open country was never actually silent, but was instead composed of 100 small sounds that the town covered up. Evelyn had been out this way twice before. Once 2 years ago when old man Garfield was still trying to make it work, before his health failed and his sons back in Missouri sent for him. And once last spring, when she'd ridden out simply because she needed to be somewhere that wasn't inside 4 walls. She hadn't admitted that to anyone either. Silas was already at the property line when she arrived Saturday morning, standing near the remains of the fence Garfield had put in, looking at something across the lower field with the focused, measuring attention of a man doing arithmetic in his head. His horse, a compact gray with a sensible temperament, Evelyn noted was tied to the fence post. He'd brought a notebook. She could see it sticking out of his coat pocket. "You're early," she said, pulling up beside him. "So are you," he said. Neither of them pointed out what that might mean. They walked the lower field first. The soil was good. She'd been right about that dark and deep, the kind that held moisture without becoming swamp. Garfield had grown hay here in better years. The remnants of it were still visible in the yellowed stubble, knee-high in places, beaten down by weather. Silas walked slowly. He crouched down twice to pick up handfuls of dirt, rubbing it between his fingers in a way that wasn't theatrical but simply practical. He made a few notes in the notebook with a short pencil he kept tucking behind his ear and then forgetting about. "The drainage here is better than I expected," he said. "Garfield dug a channel along the east edge," Evelyn said. About 10 years ago, you can see where it used to run, she pointed. It's overgrown now, but the structure's still there. Wouldn't take much to clear it. He looked where she pointed. Made another note. They walked for a while without talking. That was something she noticed, and noticing that the silence between them wasn't the uncomfortable kind that demanded filling. It was the functional kind, the kind between two people who were both paying attention to the same thing and didn't need to narrate it. The upper pasture, she said, when they'd reached the rise. There's your problem. He saw it immediately. The creek that should have served the upper land had shifted at some point, moving south by 30 or 40 yards, leaving the higher ground without reliable water access for animals. It wasn't unfixable, but it was expensive. Extending a water line from the lower property up the rise or digging a secondary well, neither was cheap and both took time. Silas stood at the top of the rise and looked north. She stood beside him. The view from up there was the kind that made people understand why settlers had kept going west even when going west made no rational sense. The mountains in the far distance were already showing their winter white. Plains between here and there were every shade of brown and gold that autumn knew how to make. The sky was the specific deep blue that only appeared at elevation, the kind that made you feel like the world was larger than you'd been giving it credit for. That's where the house would go, Silas said quietly. Not to her specifically, just out loud, the way people said things when they were thinking and had forgotten for a moment that someone else was present. Evelyn looked at what Costa was looking at. It was a good choice elevated enough to catch the breeze in summer and avoid the low-ground frost pockets in winter, with a natural windbreak of scrub pine to the northwest. It's a good spot, she said. He glanced at her. You sound surprised. I'm not surprised. She stopped. I'm trying to figure out whether you actually know what you're doing or whether you've just gotten lucky twice. That made him almost smile. Not quite. The corner of his mouth moved. 14 years working other men's ranches, he said. I've made every mistake there is to make on someone else's land, which is the best place to make them. What kind of mistakes? He was quiet for a moment. Looking at the mountains. Trusted a horse I hadn't properly assessed yet, he said. Broke 2 ribs and my left wrist. I was 22. He held up his left hand briefly, flexed it once. She could see the slight irregularity of it, the way the wrist had healed slightly wrong, a 1/4 inch off from what it should have been. Rushed a planting decision because the ranch foreman was pressuring me, and we lost most of the east field to frost that year. Wasn't my money, but it was my recommendation, and I had to live with that. He put his hand down. Trusted someone I shouldn't have, he added, quieter now. That's the one that cost the most, and took the longest to get past. She didn't ask him to explain that. He hadn't offered details. And she understood instinctively the way you understood certain things about people who'd been through particular kinds of disappointment, that it was the kind of sentence that contained a much longer story he wasn't ready to tell to someone he'd known less than a week. Everybody has one of those, she said instead. He looked at her. There was something in his expression that was careful and curious at the same time. Yeah, he said, I suppose they do. They stood on the rise for another minute. The wind was cold. She had a good coat, heavy wool, one she'd made herself 3 winters ago from a pattern she'd improved twice since then. It did its job. I'm going to put in an offer on it, Silas said. The water problem isn't nothing, but it's solvable. The rest of the land is worth it. The Garfield estate is being handled by a lawyer in Denver, she said. Thomas Colby. He has an office on Larimer Street. He's slow, but he's honest. Silas looked at her. You know the property lawyer. I know everyone who has ever done business in or around Red Willow, Evelyn said. That's not a boast. It's a consequence of running a shop in a small town for 3 years. He nodded slowly, not in a patronizing way, in the way of someone filing away a piece of information that had proved more useful than expected. Can I ask you something, he said. You can ask. The shop, he said. Your dressmaking, is it? He seemed to be choosing his words with care. Is it what you wanted to do, or is it what made sense to do when you got here? Nobody had ever asked her that. In 3 years, not once. People asked whether business was good. They asked whether she was managing. They did not ask whether the thing she'd built was the thing she'd intended. She looked out at the mountains for a moment. She thought about how to answer honestly, without giving away more than she'd decided to give. Both, she said finally. I've always been good with fabric. My mother taught me when I was young, though she'd be horrified to know what I charge for the work, because she always thought craft should be given away out of kindness. A pause. But the shop is, it's more than the sewing. The sewing is how I pay for it, but the shop is. Stopped, started again. It's mine, she said. Everything in it, every decision, every choice of fabric, and every price I set, and every customer I take on or decline. None of it exists because someone permitted me to have it. I built it from scratch, and it belongs entirely to me, and that matters in a way that's hard to explain to someone who's always been permitted to build things. She hadn't meant to say that last part. It came out before she'd fully decided to say it, which was unlike her. Silas was looking at her. His expression had changed slightly, not to pity, which she would have ended the conversation for, but to something more like recognition. I understand that, he said, more than you might think. You're a man, she said, directly, not unkindly. The world assumes you're permitted to build things. The world assumes a lot of things, he said. An orphan working day labor on other men's property doesn't feel particularly permitted. He paused, chose. He feels like he's proving something to an audience that isn't paying attention. That landed somewhere quiet in her chest. She didn't let it show. They started walking back down the rise toward the horses. The workshop, he said. She glanced at him. If this land were developed, he said carefully, and someone were building on the south side, there's a spot there, gets good light most of the day. Protected from the north wind by the tree line that would be an excellent location for a workspace that required natural light. She stopped walking. He stopped too. She looked at him, and for a long moment she did not say anything at all, because she was thinking very carefully about several things simultaneously about what he was saying and what he was not saying, and whether she trusted herself to assess the distance between those two things accurately. Mr. Mercer, she said. Silas, he said, please. Mr. Mercer sounds like someone I owe money to. Despite herself, she felt something shift very slightly, a hairline crack in the careful composure she'd been maintaining since Saturday morning. Silas, she said, I want to be clear about something. All right, I don't need rescuing. I don't need incorporating into someone else's plan. I don't need to be the solution to anyone's problem about wanting a life that has another person in it. I know that, he said. He said it simply, without defensiveness, which was more disarming than any argument would have been. Then why bring up the workshop? He looked at her. His eyes were dark and steady, and there was something in them that was serious in the way that mattered, not solemn, not heavy, but honest. Because I've been thinking about that land since the moment I saw the description, he said, and when I thought about the south spot with the good light, the first thing that came into my head was that it was the kind of location a serious craftsperson would kill for. And the second thing that came into my head was you. He paused. I'm not telling you what to do with that. I'm just telling you it's true. The wind moved across the field between them and the fence line. Evelyn turned and walked the rest of the way to the horses. She untied her mare and gathered the reins and swung up without ceremony. Silas untied his gray and mounted with the easy economy of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. They rode back toward Red Willow without speaking for the first mile. The silence wasn't comfortable exactly, but it wasn't uncomfortable either. It was charged, the way air was charged before weather changed, not threatening but aware of itself. The lawyer in Denver, Silas said, as the first buildings of town came into view. Colby, Thomas Colby, Evelyn said. I can write you a letter of introduction if you want. It'll move things faster. He looked at her sideways. You'd do that? Don't make it into something large, she said. Practical favor. I write letters of introduction regularly. It means nothing beyond what it is. All right. he said, in the tone of someone who was not entirely convinced it meant nothing beyond what it was, but was willing to let her have the position she'd staked. At the edge of town, they split without ceremony. He went north toward the boarding house. She went south toward the shop. She had a 2 o'clock fitting with Margaret Holt and approximately 40 minutes of preparation work to do before then. She told herself, riding back down Main Street, that Saturday had been productive and nothing more. She told herself that several times. It didn't entirely take. The letter of introduction got written that evening. She kept it short, professional, and entirely free of anything that could be interpreted as personal warmth, which took 3 drafts because her first instinct kept adding things that were too human to be safe. She left it at the boarding house desk Monday morning with Mrs. Calloway, who looked at the name on the envelope and then looked at Evelyn with the particular expression of a woman who had witnessed many things in a rooming house and considered all of them to be legitimately her business. For the new man, Mrs. Calloway said, "It's a letter of introduction to a lawyer in Denver," Evelyn said. For a business matter, of course, Mrs. Calloway said, in a tone that communicated she believed exactly none of this. Word in Red Willow traveled faster than weather and with less predictability. By Wednesday, the version of events circulating through the town had evolved considerably. Ruth Bauer had revised her theory the man was no longer a romantic pursuer, but was now either Evelyn's secret cousin or a man who had come west to buy the Garfield land with Evelyn's financial backing. Depending on which version of Ruth's story you caught and at what point in its development. Clara Pettigrew stopped by the shop Thursday afternoon with the specific energy of someone delivering important news. "People are talking about you and that cowboy," Clara announced, settling into the chair near the fitting mirrors without being invited. "People in Red Willow talk about everything," Evelyn said, pinning a hem without looking up. "They're saying you sent him a letter. I sent a letter to a lawyer in Denver on his behalf. It's a professional courtesy. They're saying you've been seen together. We looked at the Garfield property together last Saturday. He asked for my opinion on the land. I gave it." Clara was quiet for a moment. This was unusual for Clara. "What's he like?" she asked, and the question was different from her others' quieter, more genuine. The question of someone who was actually curious rather than collecting information for distribution. Evelyn pinned the last inch of hem. "Honest," she said after a moment. "He's honest," which is rarer than it should be and more unsettling than you'd expect. Clara looked at her for a moment with soft eyes. "Evelyn," she said gently, "you know it's all right to." "The hem is done," Evelyn said. "Was there something you needed, Clara? A fitting, alterations?" Clara sighed with the resigned patience of someone accustomed to being redirected. "I need the waistband on my brown skirt let out an inch." "Leave it, and I'll have it done by Friday." Silas came into the shop for the first time since that first Tuesday on a Thursday evening in late October, about 40 minutes before she usually closed. He didn't come with a need or a question or any particular agenda that he announced. He came in, looked around at the shop with the same careful attention he'd given the Garfield land, and said, "I sent the letter to Colby today, along with your introduction." "Thank you. You're welcome," Evelyn said. He stood near the door. She was at the work table, working on a wedding dress that wasn't hers. A young woman named Annie Dowd, who was marrying a surveyor's assistant in November and had exactly $12 to spend on her gown and the particular dignity of someone who would rather go, without then accept anything that felt like charity. Evelyn had agreed to a price that was going to cost her more than she'd make, and she'd done it without hesitation, which was the kind of thing she never examined too closely. "What are you working on?" Silas asked. "Wedding dress," she said. "Yours?" he asked. She looked up at him fast. He looked entirely serious for exactly 2 seconds, and then something shifted at the edge of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one, the ghost of something that had been trying to get out. "That was a joke," he said. "I know it was a joke," she said. though she hadn't been completely certain for those 2 seconds, and they both knew it. He moved further into the shop, not to her work table, but to the bolts of fabric along the left wall, looking at them with genuine curiosity. He touched the edge of one a deep burgundy wool without pulling it, just a brief contact. "You picked all of these yourself," he said. "Every one. I order from Denver and from a supplier in Chicago. The silk I have to order 6 months ahead because the availability is inconsistent." He was looking at a bolt of pale blue cotton, the kind that caught light in a particular way. "My mother had a dress that color," he said. He said it without sentiment, just as a fact. Or something close to it. I don't remember her well enough to be certain. She didn't say she was sorry. He hadn't said it to receive condolences. He'd said it the way people said things about the dead, when they were comfortable enough with the loss to let it exist in a room without making everyone around them manage their feelings about it. "How old were you?" she asked. 7, he said. "Father lasted another 2 years. Then I was at the county orphanage for a while, and then a series of ranches." He paused. "It wasn't as grim as it sounds. Some of the ranches were good. I learned things. It was still grim," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Yeah," he said, "it was." They were quiet for a moment. Outside, a horse-drawn delivery wagon rattled past on the road, shaking the window in its frame. "I should let you close up," Silas said. "You can stay until I close," she said. The words came out before the part of her that managed these things carefully could stop them. She added quickly, "If you're not expected elsewhere." "I'm not expected anywhere," he said, so he stayed. He sat in the chair near the fitting mirrors, not the chair for customers, but the plain wooden one against the wall that she used when she needed to rest her back, and she continued working on Annie Dowd's wedding dress. And they talked the way people talked when they were actually comfortable with each other and had stopped performing comfort. He told her about the worst ranch he'd worked a man named Decker in Wyoming, who believed that paying people was optional if he could find enough other ways to make them feel obligated to stay. He'd left that one after 6 months, in February, in a snowstorm, on foot for the first 8 miles because Decker had locked the stable, and Silas hadn't been willing to break the lock even when he probably should have. "Why not?" she said. "Because Decker wanted me to," he said. "He wanted something to hold over me. I wasn't going to give him that." She understood that completely. She told him about her first winter in Red Willow. The supplier in Denver who'd promised a fabric shipment and then canceled with 2 weeks' notice, leaving her with nothing to show 3 women who'd already paid deposits. She'd spent 14 hours on 3 consecutive days, making what she could from the limited stock she had on hand, delivering every order on the promised date, losing money on all 3 but keeping her word. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Yes, I did," she said. "My word is the only thing I have that no one else can take away from me." He was quiet for a moment. "That's exactly how I feel about my word," he said. She didn't look up from the sewing, but something in her chest did something it didn't usually do. By the time she set down the dress and stood up to start closing the shop, the lamp on her work table had burned about 2 inches down. It was dark outside. She hadn't noticed the time passing, which was the kind of thing she noticed precisely because it almost never happened. He helped her move the bolt she'd left on the edge of the work table back to the wall she hadn't asked him to. He'd simply seen it needed doing and done it, and he put on his hat at the door. "Thank you," he said, "for the company. It wasn't." She stopped. Started again. "You're welcome," she said instead. He nodded, opened the door, went out into the cold dark of a Thursday evening in October in Red Willow. Evelyn stood alone in her shop for a few minutes before she started locking up. She was doing something she didn't usually do, which was paying attention to the specific quality of a room after someone had left it. The shop was the same as it always was. Same fabric, same table, same lamp burning low. But there was something about the absence of him that was more particular than just absence. She blew out the lamp and locked the door and went home. She did not think about it. She thought about it continuously. November arrived without apology, the way November always did on the plains, not gradually, but all at once, like someone had simply decided that autumn was finished. The cold had teeth now, ice on the water barrel in the mornings. Frost on the inside of the shop windows if she didn't bank the stove well enough before she went home. Silas had put in the offer on the Garfield land. Colby in Denver was moving at his characteristic pace, which was to say he was moving like a man who believed that sufficient time spent considering a thing made it a better thing, which was occasionally true and often just slow. Silas received a letter mid-November acknowledging the offer. Another letter confirming the price agreement came the week after that. The land itself was still technically in the hands of the estate, but everyone, including the lawyer, agreed that the outcome was settled. He came into the shop twice more in November. The third time, he brought her coffee from the small eating house down the road, not a grand gesture, just 2 cups, one for him and one for her. In the casual way of someone who'd noticed, she often forgot to eat or drink anything between morning and mid-afternoon and had decided to do something practical about it. She accepted the coffee without comment and did not let on that the gesture had landed. Town was still talking. The town was always talking. And the story of the cowboy who'd come west, for Evelyn Marlowe, had by now gone through enough iterations that it had become something. The town had almost domesticated a piece of local color, a story it told itself about itself. Some of it was gentle, and some of it wasn't, because towns weren't any better than their people, and not all of Red Willow's people were good. The not gentle version came from a man named Hargrove. Frank Hargrove ran the second general store, the one with worse prices and a better location, and had twice in the past 3 years attempted to court Evelyn in the specific way of a man who believes that a woman running a business alone must be, doing it as a placeholder for the real life she'll have when someone sensible rescues her from it. She had declined both times with a clarity that left nothing open to interpretation. Hargrove had not forgiven this, in the small, petty, ongoing way of men who believed their attention was a gift rather than a preference. Evelyn was coming out of the bank on a Wednesday afternoon in mid-November when she nearly walked into Frank Hargrove and 2 of his associates on the sidewalk. She would have simply said good afternoon and moved on, because she was an adult and she had things to do, but Hargrove stopped directly in front of her in the specific way of a man who had decided something was going to happen and was using his physical size to make it happen. "Miss Marlowe," he said. He had a jovial quality that didn't reach his eyes. "Heard your mail order cowboy finally got the Garfield deed sorted." "He put in an offer," she said. "That's publicly known information." "What I heard," Hargrove said, and his 2 associates had the particular stillness of men watching a performance they'd been told to enjoy, "is that he's planning to build out there. Ranch and all. And that certain arrangements are being discussed between himself and our town's finest dressmaker." "You heard wrong," Evelyn said. "Did I?" He smiled. It was the kind of smile that was designed to look friendly and functioned like a held door that you had to walk through or admit you were afraid of. "Because what I can't figure out, Evelyn, is why a woman who's been turning down good local men for 3 years is spending her evenings entertaining a drifter who walked into town 2 months ago with nothing but a sad story and your sister's recommendation." The associates shuffled slightly, the way men shuffled when they were deciding whether to laugh. Evelyn looked at Frank Hargrove. She was not a small woman, but she was shorter than him, and this was the kind of moment where that registered and then was made irrelevant by other things. "Frank," she said, in the quietest possible voice, the one she reserved for situations that required precision rather than volume, "whatever I do with my evenings is my own business. Whatever arrangements exist or don't exist between myself and anyone in this town are my own business. And any man who tells himself that a woman's refusals are temporary conditions waiting to be corrected by the right application of persistence has a serious problem with his understanding of other people." She paused. "Are we finished?" Hargrove's jovial expression had thinned. Something uglier was visible underneath. "Just looking out for the community," he said. The community doesn't need your help with that, Evelyn said, and moved past him. She walked the 4 blocks back to her shop at her normal pace, which required some effort, because her normal pace and the pace her body wanted to move at in that moment were different speeds. She got inside. She locked the door. She went to the back room, sat down in the small chair, and allowed herself approximately 90 seconds of the particular shaking. That happened after confrontations where you kept your composure and your body had absorbed everything your face refused to show. Then she got up and went back to work. She didn't tell Silas about the exchange with Hargrove. She told herself it was because it wasn't relevant, and because she handled her own problems, and because she wasn't interested in having someone else try to manage a situation she'd already managed. All of those reasons were true. They were also not the only reasons. The other reason was that she wasn't sure what it meant that her first instinct had been to tell him. The last Thursday of November, Silas asked her to dinner. Not at the boarding house, at the eating house, on the main road, a public place, where everyone in Red Willow could see them and draw whatever conclusions they were going to draw regardless. She said yes before she thought carefully about saying yes, which was unlike her, and which she spent approximately 4 minutes interrogating immediately afterward before deciding that the interrogation was less useful than simply being honest with herself about the fact that she wanted to go. She wore her good dark blue dress, the one she'd made for herself 2 years ago on the theory that she might eventually have somewhere to wear it. Silas was already at the table when she arrived. He dressed for it not formally. He didn't appear to own anything formal, but deliberately. Clean shirt, dark jacket she hadn't seen before, hair actually managed rather than merely existing. Stood up when she came in. She noted this. She noted it the way she noted things she didn't plan to mention but found herself caring about. They ordered, and they ate, and they talked the way they'd been talking for weeks in the shop easily. Seriously. Without performing anything, but the restaurant changed the quality of it somehow. They were visible. Everyone who came in or passed by the window could see them, and neither of them moved to minimize that visibility. Over the course of dinner, Silas told her something he hadn't told her before. About the thing he'd mentioned the first day on the Garfield land, the person he'd trusted and shouldn't have. It had been a business partner. A man named Foster he'd known for years at a ranch in Colorado, who had approached him about pooling their savings to purchase a small parcel of land together. Silas had contributed $700 nearly 2 years of careful saving. Foster had taken the money, filed the deed in his own name only, and disappeared within 3 months with both the land and Silas's investment. I went after him, Silas said. I found him in New Mexico a year later. He paused, looking for words. We had a conversation. I got back about $100 and an agreement he signed that I was never going to be able to enforce. It's because he knew it and I knew it. He looked at the table for a moment. I let him go. I don't entirely know why, because the $100 wasn't what you went for, Evelyn said. He looked at her. You went to say something that needed saying, she said. And you said it. And then you let him go because continuing to pursue it would have cost you something you couldn't afford to spend. Silas was quiet. Something in his expression was different, not fragile, not grateful, but something close to relief. The look of someone who'd been carrying a story he'd told in a way that made people offer sympathy or advice, and had finally told it to someone who'd understood the part that actually mattered. That's exactly right, he said. That's exactly it. They had coffee after. The eating house was getting quiet, the late diners filtering out, the lamps being turned low at the edges of the room. I want to ask you something, Silas said, and I want you to know you don't owe me a particular answer. She looked at him steadily. Go ahead. Are you happy here? He said. In Red Willow. In the life you've built. I'm not asking about me, or any of this. I mean the life you came out here to build. Are you happy with it? She looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said. Not in every direction, not completely, but more genuinely than anything I left behind. He nodded slowly. Then it was worth it, he said. Everything it cost you to build it. Yes, she said again. And this time the word felt different, in her mouth heavier, and more certain simultaneously, like something she'd said 100 times that she was only now actually hearing. They paid and walked out into the cold November night together. Main Street was quiet. The kind of quiet that small towns fell into after a certain hour, where you could hear your own footsteps and the distant sound of someone's wood fire, and the enormous silence of all that open space pressing in around the edges of the buildings. Silas walked her to the door of her shop, which was where she'd tied her horse. This was already longer than was strictly necessary in terms of practical distance. Door, she turned to face him. They were both very aware of the fact that this was the moment in a certain kind of evening where a certain kind of thing happened, and they were both also very aware that nothing was simple here, and neither of them was pretending it was. "Thank you for dinner," she said. "Thank you for coming," he said. He was close enough that she could see the cold in his breath, and the particular steadiness of his eyes in the dark, and the way he was not reaching for her, or pressing for anything, or trying to make this moment into something she hadn't chosen. He was just standing there, present, waiting for whatever she decided. Evelyn Marlowe, who had spent 3 years being entirely certain about the terms under which she operated, was not entirely certain about anything in this particular moment. "Silas," she said. "Yes. I'm not going to pretend I don't know what this has been turning into," she said. "But I need you to understand that it's not simple for me. It's not uncomplicated. There are things I've built that matter to me more than—" "I know," he said. "I know that. You can't know that," she said. "Not really, not yet." He considered this for a moment. "Then let me prove it," he said. "Not with words. Just give me time to prove it." She looked at him in the cold dark of a November night in Red Willow, with the stars overhead enormous and indifferent, and the whole of the frontier stretching out beyond the edges of the town in every direction. "All right," she said. It was barely louder than the wind. She untied her horse, mounted, and rode home. She didn't look back. She knew, without looking, that he stood there until she turned the corner. That was the part that stayed with her longest that night, not what had been said, but that. The particular fact of a man standing in the cold watching her ride away, not to lay claim to where she was going, but simply because he wasn't ready to stop being where she'd been. She rode home under the cold November stars, and she did not let herself think too much about what she'd said, or what he'd said, or what all right meant when a woman who had spent 3 years building her own life said it to a man who had asked for time to prove that he understood what she'd built. She thought about it anyway, of course, all the way home, and later in the dark of her kitchen with the lamp burning low. But thinking about it felt different now than it had a month ago. A month ago, it had felt like a threat. Tonight it felt like something she didn't quite have a name for yet, but wasn't afraid of in the same way. That was the difference. And she recognized it as exactly the kind of difference that changed everything. Even when you were being careful, even when you were watching for it, even when you were the most self-sufficient woman in Red Willow who had sworn 3 years ago that she would never again need anything she couldn't build herself. Even then, December came the way it always did in that part of the country, not with the polite retreat of autumn, but with the full weight of a season that had been waiting its turn and was done waiting. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 days. The road through town turned to frozen ruts that rattled wagon wheels and made horses careful with their footing. The mountains to the northwest disappeared behind clouds for a week, and when they came back, they were entirely white. Evelyn had lived through 2 winters in Red Willow and understood its specific demands. She banked the shop stove before she left each night. She kept an extra pair of wool gloves at her work table because her hands, exposed to the cold on the walk from home each morning, took time to warm up enough for fine work. She stocked extra lamp oil in December because the days were short and she worked past dark whether she wanted to or not. This December was the same as the others in practical terms. In less practical terms, it was entirely different. Something had shifted after that Thursday dinner in November. Nothing dramatic, no declarations, no formal acknowledgement, No conversation where they sat down and defined what the evenings had become. Quieter than that, more incremental. The kind of change that happened so gradually that you couldn't point to any single moment and say that's where it started, but that accumulated over days and weeks until the weight of it was undeniable. Silas came to the shop on Tuesdays and Thursdays now. Not every week, not with the clockwork regularity that would have made it a habit she'd had to decide about, but often enough that she noticed the weeks when he didn't come. He always left before darkness fully settled, that was his rule. Not hers, and she'd understood without being told that it was about her reputation, which was the kind of practical consideration she could respect, even while finding it slightly irritating that it was necessary. They talked about the land, about his plans for the spring, about the water problem and its possible solutions. They talked about her suppliers, about a difficult commission she'd taken on from a woman in Clearwater who'd sent measurements that were clearly wrong in one direction or another and would need to be renegotiated. They talked about things that had nothing to do with any of that, about the books they'd read, about the particular loneliness of winter in open country, about the things people told themselves to make the distance between where they were and where they'd imagined being feel manageable. He never pushed. That was the thing she kept coming back to. He never pushed, never maneuvered, never applied the gentle, persistent pressure that she'd from other men who believed that women's uncertainty was simply a problem of insufficient convincing. He said what he thought when it was relevant and let the space between them exist without filling it with claims. This should have been reassuring. It was, in fact, more unsettling than pressure would have been, because pressure she knew how to manage. This whatever this was, she was less certain about. The question of what she was doing occupied a significant portion of her thinking through the first 2 weeks of December, taking up the mental space usually reserved for inventory calculations and order deadlines. She was aware that she was not behaving with the full consistency of a woman who had decided she didn't need anyone, which was problematic because she had very much built her self-understanding around being that woman. The thing Louisa had written kept surfacing. Being capable is not the same as being whole. She resented it. She also couldn't dismiss it. The trouble with Frank Hargrove, which she had not told Silas about, which she had continued to not tell Silas about, which was beginning to feel less like discretion and more like carrying something unnecessarily heavy, escalated on a Wednesday morning in the second week of December. She had a delivery coming from Denver. Twice a year she received a significant shipment of fabric and supplies from her main supplier, timed to arrive before Christmas when orders increased. And she'd arranged for it to come by wagon with a driver named Colton she'd used reliably for 2 years. The delivery was supposed to arrive Wednesday before noon. By 2 in the afternoon it hadn't come. She sent a message to the freight office at the edge of town, which came back with information that the Denver wagon had arrived that morning, but that her order had been there, with some confusion about the paperwork held for clarification before release. The freight manager's name was Art Tibbs. Evelyn had done business with Art Tibbs without incident for 3 years. She walked to the freight office and asked what clarification was needed, and Art Tibbs, who had the particular quality of a man trying to be fair and finding it difficult under current circumstances, told her that there was a question about whether her business credit account was still in good standing. "My account is in perfect standing," she said. "I know," Art said. "That's what I told them." "Told who?" Art looked at the wall to the left of her face. "Art," she said quietly. "Told who?" There was someone who came in Monday," Art said. "Someone who asked me some questions about your account status. I told him everything was fine. He seemed to suggest that he'd heard otherwise, and that maybe it would be responsible to confirm before releasing goods on account." "Who?" Evelyn said in the voice she normally kept in reserve. Art finally looked at her. He had the expression of a man who had made a mistake he understood fully only in retrospect. "Hargrove," he said. She stood in Art Tibbs's office for a moment without saying anything. Frank Hargrove had walked into the freight office 2 days before her delivery was due and planted a question about the reliability of her credit. Not an accusation, something far more insidious than that. Suggestion, a wondering aloud. The kind of thing that couldn't be directly addressed or refuted because it hadn't technically been said, just implied hard enough that a man like Art Tibbs, who was decent but not particularly brave, had let it make him cautious. "Release my order, Art," she said. "Yes, Evelyn, I'm sorry." I should have released it," she said. "And then consider carefully whether you want Frank Hargrove to be the kind of man whose suggestions affect how you conduct business. Because the next person he does this to might not be as patient as I'm being right now." She walked back to her shop with her delivery, which Colton brought around in the wagon an hour later. She unloaded every bolt and crate herself. She did not ask for help, and nobody offered any, which was fine. She needed something physical to do with the particular quality of fury that was moving through her. The fury wasn't simple. It wasn't just anger at Hargrove, though there was plenty of that. It was also anger at the specific mechanics of what he'd done, the way you couldn't fight a suggestion, the way a question planted in the right place could do real damage without ever becoming something you could point to and name. She'd spent 3 years building a reputation in this town that was solid enough to withstand this particular attack. But that wasn't always going to be true, and he knew it. She thought about telling Silas. She thought about it for 2 days. On Friday evening, when he came in for his regular visit, and she was still quieter than usual, he noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed things without making a performance of noticing them, which was one of the qualities she'd identified early on as something she trusted about him. "Something happened," he said. "Not a question. It's handled," she said. "All right," he said. He didn't push. He sat in the wooden chair and watched her work for a few minutes and let the quiet settle. "Hargrove," she said finally, to her work table, not to him. He was still, she told him. The whole thing, the Monday visit to the freight office, the implication, the 2-day delay, the conversation with Art Tibbs. She told it the way she told things, which was factually and without decorating it with more emotion than was accurate. When she finished, the shop was very quiet. "Is this the first time he's done something like this?" Silas said. "The first time it's gotten that specific," she said. "Been hostile, in a general way, for about 2 years. Since I turned him down the second time," she looked up from the fabric. "I handled it." "I know you did," Silas said. "I don't need you to." "Evelyn," his voice was quiet and direct, "I know you handled it." "I'm not questioning that." He paused. "Just want to be clear about something. I'm not sitting here trying to figure out how to get involved in something you've already managed. I'm sitting here being angry on your behalf because you went through something unfair and you've been carrying it alone for 2 days. And that matters to me. That's different from wanting to fix it." She looked at him. He looked back at her, steady and serious. The distinction he'd drawn between wanting to manage her situation and simply being present for the fact of it landed somewhere in her chest in a way she wasn't entirely prepared for. It was such a specific distinction. It required understanding something about her that most people either didn't know or didn't care to apply. "All right," she said after a moment. "All right," he said. They sat with it for a while. The stove crackled. Outside, the wind moved along the front of the building the way it did on cold December nights, finding the gaps. "He's not going to stop," Silas said eventually. "Not as a threat, just as an assessment." "I know," she said. "What he did is small enough that confronting it directly makes you look like you're overreacting. Large enough that ignoring it lets him think it worked." "I know that too," she said. "I've been thinking about it for 2 days." "What are you going to do?" She picked up her needle. "Set it down again. The same thing I've done for 3 years," she said. "Be so visibly, undeniably competent that anyone who questions my standing looks like an idiot. It's not satisfying, it's effective." Silas was quiet for a moment. "That's the right call," he said. She hadn't expected him to agree. She'd half expected a counter-suggestion, Something more direct, more confrontational, the approach that men usually preferred because it felt more decisive than the slow accumulation of reputation. "You sound surprised," he said, watching her. "I am a little," she admitted. "You've been doing this longer than I've known this town exists," he said. "I'd be a fool to think I know better than you how to manage your standing in it." She looked at him for a long moment, looked away. "You're not what I expected," she said. It came out quieter than she'd intended. "What did you expect?" She considered this honestly. "Someone who would need to be right more than he needed to be useful," she said. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile. "Something more serious than that. I've met a lot of men like that," he said. "I didn't want to become one." The lamp burned, the stove held. Outside, Red Willow continued doing what small towns did in winter evenings, which was mostly quietly endure. The deed for the Garfield property came through the second week of December. Silas received it on a Tuesday, and he came into the shop that afternoon with it in his hand, and the specific expression of a man trying to contain something significant without making it theatrical. He handed it to her. She read it. His name on a piece of legal paper, attached to 160 acres of land northeast of town. She handed it back to him. "Congratulations," she said. The word felt inadequate. She could see in his face what this meant, not just the land, but the fact of his name on it, the 14 years of someone else's property, finally giving way to something that was entirely, legally, undeniably his. "Thank you," he said. His voice was slightly different. Not broken nothing in Silas Mercer was fragile enough to break visibly but different. Layered. Like there were things underneath the word that weren't going to be said and didn't need to be. "The water problem," she said, giving him something practical to hold on to. "Spring is when you'll need to address it, before you can run any animals on the upper pasture." "I know," he said. "I've been looking at the options." He'd been talking to a man in Clearwater who had experience digging secondary wells in this specific type of soil. The cost was manageable, he said, less than he'd feared. "The house," she said. "When?" "Spring," he said. "There's a builder in Red Willow, Patterson," the younger one, who said he could start in April if the ground thaws on schedule. She nodded. She was aware, with the particular precision of someone paying close attention to things they hadn't decided what to do with,
that they were having a practical conversation about the details of a future
that she had not formally agreed to be part of. And she was participating in it. She was asked questions and receiving answers and treating the whole thing as though it were a matter of course. Neither of them mentioned this. "Come out and see it," Silas said. "The land. I want to walk it again now that it's actually mine." "I'd like you to come." "When?" "Saturday. Same as before." "I have a fitting at noon," she said. "Morning then," he said. Same as before. She looked at him. He was looking at her with that particular steadiness she'd come to recognize the look of a man who had learned, somewhere in 14 years of doing other people's work, how to want something very much and still hold it loosely enough that it didn't damage him if it didn't come. "Saturday morning," she said. They walked the property for 2 hours on a Saturday that was so cold their breath came out in clouds and the ground was iron hard under their boots. The land looked different with winter on it, stripped down, all its bones showing, the way things sometimes looked more honestly in the cold. He walked every boundary line. She walked it with him. They were mostly quiet, punctuated by brief conversations about practical things, fence placement, where the access road would need to be widened, the natural slope of the land, and what it meant for drainage. At the south side of the property, he stopped. It was the spot he'd mentioned that first day. The one with the good southern light, sheltered from the north wind by the line of scrub pine. In summer, the light here would be something extraordinary long hours of direct sun from the southeast, indirect warm light through the rest of the day. She stood there for a moment without saying anything. She could see it. That was the thing she hadn't expected, that she would stand in a spot and actually see something that wasn't there yet. She could see the dimensions of a workspace that worked with the light instead of fighting it. She could see where she would put the large work table, which direction the mirrors would face, how she would arrange the storage so that each bolt of fabric was accessible without crossing the room. She could see it so clearly it was almost embarrassing. "The light here is," she stopped. "I know," he said. She looked at him. He wasn't performing anything. He wasn't watching her face for the reaction he wanted. He was just standing in the cold with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the same piece of frozen ground she was looking at, waiting to see what she decided. "I'm not agreeing to anything," she said. "I know that," he said. "I'm just looking. That's all I asked you to do." She looked for a long moment, at the light, at the angle of the pine trees, at the frost-gray sky above the property line. "The access from the road would need to be separate," she said finally. "A dedicated entrance, not through the ranch yard." "It was still separate business," she said, "separate entrance." "Whatever that space becomes, it has a door to the outside world that doesn't go through anyone else's property first." "Of course," he said. "Not quickly, not as capitulation as agreement between people who understood each other." She looked one more time at the spot with the good light. Then she turned and they walked back toward the horses. She had a noon fitting with Margaret Holt's daughter, who was preparing for a spring wedding and who had, in the past 3 weeks, changed her mind about the neckline twice. Evelyn had the patience for it because she'd learned that the dress was often the only thing in a wedding that the bride actually controlled, and necklines mattered for that reason. On the ride back, Silas said something he'd been working toward. She could tell the particular rhythm of his speech had the quality of a man approaching something he'd rehearsed slightly. "I've been thinking about something you said," he said. "In October, on the land the first time. Said several things in October," she said. "You said the shop was yours, that everything it existed because of you, not because anyone permitted you to have it." She waited. "I want you to know," he said, "that if anything happens between us, whatever shape it takes, whatever you decide, that's still true. Whatever you build is still yours. I'm not interested in having ownership of something that was built without me." The horses moved, the frozen ground crunched. The wind came across the open field from the northwest. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because you stood in that spot and you could see it," he said. "And I could see that you could see it. And I want you to know that the seeing doesn't obligate you to anything. Not to me. Not to any version of the future I might be imagining." He glanced at her. "You get to want it for its own sake, because it's a good space, and you're a serious craftsperson who deserves a serious workspace. That's complete on its own." Evelyn rode for a while without speaking. "You're either," she said finally, "a very good man or a very strategic one." "Probably both," he said. "Same as you being brave and scared at the same time." She looked at him sharply. He met her look. He didn't retreat from it. "I'm not scared," she said. "All right," he said, in the tone that meant he disagreed and was choosing not to argue. She faced forward again. The town was visible now, the wood smoke over the rooftops, the specific silhouette of Red Willow against the winter sky. "I'm cautious," she said after a moment. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes," she said. "Scared means you run. Cautious means you walk carefully." He considered this. "Fair enough," he said. They reached the edge of town and split again, him north, her south, and she went to her shop and prepared for Margaret Holt's daughter and her changing neckline. And she thought about the spot with the good light for approximately the entire fitting without being aware that she was doing it. Christmas in Red Willow was a functional affair. The town put up what decorations it could manage, which mostly meant pine boughs along the storefronts and a modest gathering at the meeting hall on Christmas Eve. Evelyn went every year because it was the kind of thing a person did when they decided to belong to a place, even when the belonging was sometimes uncomfortable. This year Silas went too. It was not the first time they'd been in public together in a context that wasn't purely practical. The dinner in November had established that. But the Christmas gathering was something different. It was the whole town. It was social in the broadest sense. and it meant that standing in proximity to each other in that room was something everyone present would see and interpret and discuss for the next 2 weeks. She arrived with Clara Pettigrew, which was a thing she'd done the past 2 years, and found Silas already there with a cup of something warm that the meeting hall's committee had provided, talking to old Pete from the livery about horses, which was apparently the only subject on which Pete would voluntarily hold an extended conversation. Silas saw her when she came in. He didn't make a move toward her immediately. He finished the thought he was having with Pete, laughed once at something Pete said, and then crossed the room at a natural pace that didn't announce itself. "Miss Marlowe," he said. "Mr. Mercer," she said. And then, because Clara was standing right there with enormous attentive eyes, Silas. Clara was visibly delighted by this. Evelyn chose not to acknowledge it. The evening moved the way these evenings did. The gathering wasn't large, but it contained most of Red Willow's permanent population, which meant it also contained Frank Hargrove, who was present near the back with 2 men from his store and the specific quality of a man who was watching something he didn't like without being willing to look away from it. Evelyn was aware of him the way you were aware of a weather front coming in, not panicked, just informed. Kept track of where he was in the room without looking at him directly, which was a skill she'd developed without deciding to. At some point in the middle of the evening, she and Silas ended up near the front windows, slightly away from the main gathering, with 2 cups of hot cider between them and the cold-fogged glass behind them. "Hargrove's been watching you for the past hour," Silas said quietly. "I know," she said. "Does that bother you?" "No," she said. Then, more honestly, a little. He didn't say anything to that. He stood beside her, not between her and Hargrove, not in the protective positioning of a man trying to insert himself as a shield, but simply beside her, present and calm. She found she valued the distinction more than she would have expected to. "Tell me something," she said, keeping her voice low. "And tell me honestly. All right. Do you ever think about whether it's worth it? The complications. The town gossip, the Hargroves of the world, the fact that I'm not," she paused. "I'm not easy, Silas. I don't make things comfortable. I push back on things. I keep my own counsel. I don't bend the way some women bend." He looked at her with an expression she'd seen before but hadn't fully named yet. It was the look of a man taking a question seriously instead of reaching for the nearest reassuring answer. "I think about whether it's complicated," he said. "Not whether it's worth it. I haven't thought it wasn't worth it once." "Why not?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the fogged glass, the December wind moved across the frozen road. "Because I've spent a long time around Easy," he said. "Easy doesn't ask you to be better than you were yesterday. Easy doesn't have opinions about things that matter. Easy doesn't look at you the way you look at people like you're actually seeing them." He paused. "I'm not interested in Easy." She looked at him. "I've been told," she said carefully, "by more than one person, that I'm difficult." "Different word for the same thing," he said. "Worth it doesn't mean simple." The gathering moved around them. Someone played a fiddle badly in the far corner, and 2 children ran between adults' legs in a way that suggested someone's patience was about to expire. Clara found someone else to talk to, and occasionally shot significant looks across the room in Evelyn's direction, which Evelyn ignored with practiced efficiency. Hargrove left early, which she noted without satisfaction. Not early enough to look defeated, but early enough that she understood he'd found the room uncomfortable for reasons he wasn't going to examine. She and Silas stayed until near the end, and she found that she was glad she'd come in a way that was different from the functional gladness of previous years. It was warmer, more actual. She didn't know quite what to do with that. The week between Christmas and the New Year was slow for business, which was the same every year, and Evelyn used the time to catch up on the work she'd been pushing to the edges, mending her own clothes, reorganizing the fabric storage by weight and season, writing letters she'd been composing in her head for weeks. One of those letters was to Louisa, She'd been avoiding writing to Louisa with anything other than practical information since October, because writing to Louisa honestly would require her to say things she wasn't ready to say. And Louisa would read between every line anyway and feel completely vindicated about the cowboy she'd sent west, which was an irritating prospect. But the year was ending, and she was 32 years old, and there was a man who came into her shop twice a week and treated her like someone worth the effort. And there was a piece of land 3 miles from town with a south-facing spot that caught good light. And she had spent the Christmas gathering in Red Willow standing beside that man and feeling more settled in that room than she had in 3 years of attending alone. She wrote the letter on the 28th, sitting at her kitchen table in the early morning when the lamp made a small, warm circle in the cold dark. Lou, I'm not going to say you were right. You weren't entirely right. You made a decision about my life without asking me, and that was presumptuous, and I'd like that on the record. But I'll say this, and I'll say it exactly once. So pay attention. He is what you said he was. He is a real one. I don't know yet what I'm going to do about that, or what shape this is going to take, or how any of the practical questions get answered. But I wanted you to know before the year ended that I see it. The shop is going well. Red Willow is cold. I hope the children are healthy. Write back when you can. Evie, she sealed it before she could revise it, which was the only way she ever sent honest letters. January arrived, and the cold deepened, which in that part of the country meant it became something you stopped being surprised by and simply incorporated into every calculation. Evelyn wore 2 coats on the worst mornings. She kept a blanket over her lap at the work table. She ordered firewood 3 weeks earlier than she had the previous year, which turned out to be a good decision because the supply got tight by mid-January. Silas was working less at Harkin's Now Winter, slowed the lumber operation considerably, and spent more time planning for spring. He came to the shop more often, sometimes in the afternoons on days when the cold made outdoor work impractical. He brought his notebook. He spread out sketches of the property, and they talked about the layout, the ranch buildings, the positioning of the fence lines, the practical order in which things would need to happen for the spring work to go smoothly. She found herself contributing to these planning conversations with a specificity that she noticed and chose not to examine too closely. Where the barn should face for wind protection, whether the main house needed a covered porch on the west side, or whether the tree line was sufficient. The dimensions of the workshop space, not her workshop, just the workshop he'd planned to include on the property, and whether the proposed layout accounted for the reality of moving large bolts of fabric in and out of the space without navigating doorways that were too narrow. She knew a great deal about doorway width as it happened. It was the kind of specific knowledge you accumulated when you'd been moving bolts of fabric through doors for 3 years. Silas listened to all of it. He wrote things down. He changed the sketch twice based on things she said. He never treated her observations as assistance. He treated them as data from someone with relevant expertise, which was not the same thing, and the distinction mattered enormously to her even though she'd never said so. On a Tuesday afternoon in mid-January, while they were looking at a revised sketch of the south side of the property, she said, without quite deciding to say it, the workshop were to become mine, hypothetically. He went very still. If it were mine, she continued, her voice careful, the entrance would need to be on the east side, not the south. Southern entrance gets blocked by the snowdrift pattern in winter. You lose access 3 or 4 times a season. He looked at the sketch. He looked at her. He picked up his pencil. East side, he said. He redrew the entrance. She watched his hand move across the paper. That's a hypothetical, she said. I know, he said. I haven't decided anything. I know that too, he said. He set the pencil down. He looked at her, not searching, not pressing, just looking with that particular steadiness. Evelyn, don't, she said slightly too quickly. He blinked. Don't make it into something I have to respond to right now, she said. I'm not, I just need, she stopped, pressed her hands flat on the table. I'm thinking, she said. I've been thinking for a long time, and I'm not finished yet. All right, he said. I just need you to let me finish thinking. Take whatever time you need, he said. That's not going anywhere. A pause. I'm not going anywhere. She believed him. That was the part that caught at her. She believed him in the way you believed things that had been demonstrated rather than said, that had accumulated over months of small, consistent choices rather than arriving all at once in a moment designed to be convincing. She believed him, and it terrified her in a way that had nothing to do with him. It had to do with what happened when you let yourself believe something, and it turned out to be wrong. With the specific damage that did, not the kind you recovered from quickly, and moved on the deeper kind, the quiet kind, the kind that reconfigured what you thought you were capable of. She had not let herself be that vulnerable in a very long time. She had been very careful about it. The cost of that care was Louisa's voice in her head, from a letter in a drawer. Being capable is not the same as being whole. She sat at her work table in the cold January afternoon, with Silas Mercer's sketch of a workshop with an east-facing entrance on the table in front of her. And she understood with the clarity that only came when you'd been avoiding a thing long enough that the avoidance itself became exhausting. She understood that she was going to have to make a decision. Not about the workshop, not about the land or the logistics or the practical architecture of a shared future. About whether she was willing to be afraid and do it anyway. That was the real question. Everything else was detail. And the answer the one she'd been working toward since a stranger walked into her shop on a Tuesday afternoon in October with his hat in both hands was forming itself in the deep quiet of her. Below the arguments and the caution and the very reasonable list of reasons to keep the walls where she'd built them. She wasn't ready to say it out loud yet, but she knew what it was. And knowing was its own particular kind of terrifying, because once you knew something true about yourself, you couldn't go back to the comfortable project of not knowing it. The sketch sat on the table between them, the east-facing entrance, the workshop that was hypothetically hers. The lamp burned. The stove held. Outside, January and Red Willow did what it always did, which was press in from every direction and dare you to believe that spring was coming. She picked up her needle. She made 3 careful stitches. And somewhere below all of it, quiet and certain, and no longer as frightening as it had been that morning, something that had been closed for a very long time began slowly to open. She didn't sleep well in February. This was not something she admitted to anyone, and it was not the dramatic sleeplessness of someone in crisis, no staring at the ceiling, no sitting up in the dark with her heart going wrong. It was quieter than that. She'd wake at 3 in the morning with particular alertness of someone whose mind had been working while her body rested and had arrived somewhere it wanted to report back from. She'd lie still for a while, listening to the wind off the plains, and eventually she'd get up and make tea and sit at the kitchen table with the lamp on low and think about whatever it was her sleeping mind had decided was urgent. Most nights the urgent thing was the same. She was in love with Silas Mercer. She'd known it for longer than she'd admitted it to herself, which was the kind of thing you could only see clearly in retrospect, the way you looked back over a series of moments and understood that the thing you thought was developing had actually already arrived, quietly, while you were looking in another direction. She couldn't point to the exact day. She suspected it had been somewhere in November, maybe the evening in the shop, when he'd explained the difference between managing her situation and being angry on her behalf. That specific distinction, the fact that he'd known there was a difference and had named it precisely. That was when it had stopped being something she was considering and become something she was afraid of. Fear, it turned out, had its own specific weight at 3 in the morning. Not the fear of him. She had stopped being afraid of Silas specifically weeks ago. The fear was older than him. It lived in the space between who she'd decided to be and what it would cost her to let someone close enough to see all of it. Not the capable parts, not the businesswoman, the reputation, the woman who ran a fair shop and helped struggling families and handled Frank Hargrove with quiet precision. The other parts, The ones that woke up at 3 in the morning and sat in the dark kitchen with tea that went cold while she forgot to drink it. She was 32 years old, and she understood herself well enough to know that the walls she'd built were not purely about independence. Some of them were about something she'd never said plainly, not even to Louisa, not even to herself in the direct terms it deserved. She had loved someone before she came west. Not a great love, not a story she told just a man she'd trusted and given her heart to, who had taken 3 years of her life and her entire savings when he left, and who had done it so carefully, so incrementally, that she'd been confused rather than angry for the first 6 months afterward. Angry came later, clarity came later still, and with it, the resolution that she would never again be in a position where someone else's decisions could unmake what she'd built. She'd built something unmakeable by others in Red Willow. That was the truth of it. That was what the shop was, underneath the practicality, a fortress constructed with fabric and needle and 3 years of 7-day weeks. Silas had walked into that fortress and had not tried to take anything from it. He had instead brought his own notebook, his own plans, his own 14 years of building other men's things. And he had sat in the chair against the wall and talked to her like someone who had also spent considerable time protecting something important and understood the instinct from the inside. At 3 in the morning in February, with the wind off the plains pressing against the windows, Evelyn sat with her cold tea and understood that the question was no longer whether she loved him. The question was whether she was brave enough to let it be true out loud. She was distracted enough by this internal negotiation that she almost missed what was happening with Frank Hargrove until it had already gone further than she'd expected. It started with Margaret Holt, who came into the shop on a Wednesday in early February, with the particular expression of a woman delivering uncomfortable information she felt was necessary. Margaret was a fair-minded person. She wouldn't have come if she didn't believe it mattered. "I think you should know," Margaret said, sitting in the fitting chair while Evelyn adjusted the hem of the jacket she'd brought in, "what Frank Hargrove has been saying at the men's meeting." Evelyn kept her hands moving. "Tell me." "He's been suggesting," Margaret said carefully, "that the stranger you've been spending time with has a background that wouldn't stand up to scrutiny. That there might be reasons someone like him spent 14 years working other men's ranches without settling anywhere." Evelyn set down her pins. "He's implying Silas has something to hide," she said. "He's not implying it very subtly," Margaret said. "He told the men's meeting he'd heard things from someone who knew someone in Colorado. No specifics, just enough to make people wonder. The men's meeting was a loosely organized gathering of Red Willow's established property owners that met twice a month. It had no official standing, but it had considerable social weight, the kind of informal authority that decided whose credit applications got smooth handling and whose fence disputes got quietly resolved and whose business was welcomed into. The community, and whose was watched with suspicion. A rumor dropped in that room with no specifics and no source was almost impossible to fight directly. That was the architecture of it. You couldn't disprove something that hadn't technically been stated. "Thank you," Evelyn said, "for telling me. I thought you should know," Margaret said again. She paused. "For what it's worth, Harold thinks the man is solid." He said so directly when Hargrove started talking. It didn't stop the conversation, but it helped. Harold Holt was the mill foreman and one of the more respected men in the community. That helped, as Margaret said. Not enough, but something. After Margaret left, Evelyn stood at her work table for a while without picking anything up. This was different from what Hargrove had done in December with the freight account. That had been aimed at her. This was aimed at Silas, which meant it had a different kind of intent behind it. It was not about discrediting a business account. It was about undermining a man standing in a community he'd only recently entered, in a place where standing was hard to build and easy to damage. She thought about Silas's notebook with the careful sketches. She thought about 14 years of other men's ranches and one man named Foster who had taken everything and left. She thought about the left wrist that had healed slightly wrong. She thought about him standing in the cold outside the eating house in November, watching her ride away, because he wasn't ready to be where she'd been. Put on her coat and walked to the boarding house. He was in the small common room off the main hallway, where Mrs. Calloway allowed her tenants to sit in the evenings. He was alone, reading something that looked like a government land survey document, which was the least surprising thing she could have imagined him doing. He looked up when she came in. He read her face immediately. She could see it, the slight sharpening of his attention. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand," she said, but she came further into the room. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without deciding what to do about it before I finish." All right. She told him about Margaret Holt's visit, the men's meeting, Hargrove's implication, the shadowy suggestion about Colorado, about things that wouldn't stand up to scrutiny. Silas listened without interrupting. His face was doing something she hadn't seen it do before it was still, but the stillness had a different quality than his usual calm. This was controlled. This was a man keeping something in check that was pulling hard against the restraint. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. "Colorado," he said. "He said he'd heard something from someone who knew someone there," Evelyn said. "No specifics. He knows about Foster," Silas said. His voice was flat. "The man who took your savings." "If you know where to look," Silas said, "you can find a record of a land dispute in Denver County from 7 years ago. Foster's name and mine on the same filing. The resolution makes it look like a mutual disagreement rather than what it actually was." He paused. "I tried to get it corrected. The lawyer told me the paperwork cost more than I'd get back from it." There it was. The thing Hargrove had found, or invented, or half-invented enough of a shadow to work with, not enough substance to disprove. "He's going to use it at the next men's meeting," Evelyn said. "Probably," Silas said. "If he does, it'll be harder to counter. The longer it sits without a response, the more it becomes part of what people think they know." Silas stood up. He wasn't a man who paced. She'd noticed that about him, the way he stayed still when most men moved around under stress, but he walked to the window and stood there for a moment, looking out at the dark February road. "What do you want to do?" she said. He turned to look at her. "What do you think I should do?" "I think," she said slowly, "that you need to get ahead of it. Talk to Harold Holt directly. Tell him the real story, Foster. The money. The Denver record. All of it. Harold is the kind of man who respects people who don't hide from things. And if he doesn't believe me, he might not initially," she said. "But Harold Holt has lived in this town for 20 years, and he's seen Frank Hargrove try to undermine people before. He knows the pattern." She paused. "He told Margaret you were solid. He's already inclined to believe you. Give him the facts and let him work with them." Silas was looking at her with the expression she'd seen at the Christmas, gathering the one that was complex and quiet and contained more layers than she could read all at once. "You didn't have to come tell me this tonight," he said. "No," she said. "I didn't. Why did you?" She looked at him for a moment. In the low light of the boarding house common room, with the sound of the wind outside and the distant creak of the building settling in the cold, she let herself say something that was true without wrapping it in the usual careful qualifications. "Because what Hargrove is doing is unfair," she said. "And because you matter enough to me that unfair things happening to you feel like my business." He was very still. "Evelyn," he said. "Don't," she said again, but differently than she'd said it in January. Less defensive, more like a request from someone who wasn't ready for the next part yet, but was getting closer. He nodded once. "I'll talk to Harold Holt tomorrow," he said. "Good," she said. She picked up her coat from where she'd set it over a chair. "Let me know how it goes." She was at the door when he said her name again. She stopped. "Thank you," he said. Just that. She went out into the February cold without answering, because the answer that wanted to come out was one she wasn't ready to say standing in a boarding house doorway. And she had enough self-knowledge left to recognize the difference between almost ready and actually ready. Silas talked to Harold Holt on a Thursday. Evelyn didn't ask him for details that evening. She knew how to let things develop their own timing. But on Friday afternoon, Harold Holt stopped into her shop, ostensibly to discuss the final payment on his wife's jacket, and took a few extra minutes before he left. "Your friend," Harold said, putting on his hat near the door. "He came and talked to me. I heard he was going to," Evelyn said. Harold nodded slowly. He was a large, deliberate man who had the quality of someone who had made most of his major mistakes early enough in life to learn from them. He told it straight, no dressing it up, just the facts and what they actually were versus how they looked on paper. Evelyn waited. "I've known Frank Hargrove for 12 years, Harold said. "I know what he does with a sharp edge when he finds one." He picked up his hat and turned it in his hands briefly. "I'm going to say something at the next men's meeting before Frank has the chance to say it first. Not about your friend specifically, just about the general habit of repeating things people have heard from someone who heard it from someone else." "That's generous, Harold. It's sensible," Harold said. "This town needs people who come here and build things. We've got enough of the other kind already." He put his hat on. "Good afternoon, Evelyn." He left, and Evelyn stood at her work table, and for the first time in several weeks, the February tightness in her chest eased by a measurable amount. She told Silas about Harold's visit when he came in Tuesday evening. He received the information the way he received most things, quietly, with the brief expression of a man letting something land before he decided what to do with it. "He didn't have to do that," Silas said. "No," she agreed. "He's a fair man. There aren't as many of those as there should be." "No," she said. "There aren't." They were quiet for a moment. She was working on a commission, a dress for the wife of the new assay office manager, a woman named Dorothy Crane, who had recently arrived from St. Louis and had very specific ideas about what Western women wore versus what she intended to keep wearing, which Evelyn had found more refreshing than irritating. "I want to tell you something," Silas said. She glanced up. He was in the wooden chair, his notebook closed on his knee for once. His hands were resting on it in the particular stillness that meant he was saying something he'd thought about rather than something that had just occurred to him. "I've been in Red Willow since October," he said. "That's 4 months. And I know that's not a long time by most measures. I know I'm still someone this town is deciding about." "The town is mostly decided," she said. Harold helped. "But you helped yourself more. I want you to know," he said, "that regardless of what happens between us, or with the land, or any of it, I'm not leaving Red Willow. I'm not going to turn out to be someone who showed up, made things complicated, and moved on." He paused. "I just want that to be clear, separate from everything else." She looked at him over the edge of the fabric she was holding. "Why are you telling me that specifically?" she said. He met her eyes. "Because I think you need to know that the risk you're considering isn't a risk of being left alone again," he said. "It's a different risk than that." The shop was very quiet. He had not said, "I know what happened to you," before you came west. He hadn't said that because she hadn't told him, and he wasn't the kind of man who assumed. But he had seen enough in 4 months of paying careful attention to understand the shape of it. She set down the fabric. "You figured that out," she said. "It wasn't quite a question, some of it," he said. "Not the specifics, just the shape of it." She looked at her work table for a moment. The scratch across the center where she'd dragged a pair of shears too fast 2 years ago. The ink stain at the left corner where she'd set a pen down without thinking. The things that accumulated on a surface you'd been working on long enough to stop seeing. "His name was Daniel," she said. She hadn't said his name out loud in 2 years. "We were together for 3 years. I thought she stopped. Reorganized. I gave him things I shouldn't have given someone I didn't know as well as I believed I did." Silas didn't say anything. He didn't move. He gave her the space of his attention without filling it. "He left," she said. "He did it gradually, which is worse than a clean break, because you spend 6 months arguing with yourself about whether you're reading the situation correctly before you're willing to accept that you are." She picked up the fabric again. Put it back down. He took most of what I'd saved. Not illegally, I'd trusted him with it, which is its own kind of humiliation. She paused. That's why I came west. There was nothing left to leave behind. The lamp burned. Thank you for telling me, Silas said. Quietly, without moving toward her, without reaching for her hand, without doing any of the things that would have made the moment about comfort rather than truth. I'm telling you, she said, because you were right about the shape of it, and it seems dishonest to let you work around something you've already correctly identified without confirming it. She looked at him. And because you told me about Foster, that's not the same thing, he said. No, she said. Mine is worse. Mine is about trusting someone I should have known better than to trust. Yours is about trusting someone who spent years being trustworthy and then stopped. Different failures. Yours isn't a failure, he said. His voice had a quiet firmness to it. Trusting someone is not a failure. What happened after is on him, not on you. I know that, she said. Intellectually, I have known that for 3 years. She paused. The other part takes longer. He nodded slowly. Yeah, he said. The other part takes longer. They sat with it. The particular companionship of two people who had each been wrong about someone in a way that cost them significantly, sitting across a work table from each other in a lamp-lit shop in the middle of a frontier winter, and not pretending that was a simple thing to carry. February moved into March with the reluctant quality of a season that knew it was losing but wasn't ready to admit it. The ice on the water barrel cracked and refroze and cracked again. The mountains showed thin lines of something that wasn't quite snowmelt, but suggested it was thinking about it. The days got longer in the slow increment way that you only noticed if you'd been paying attention to the exact time darkness fell for several months straight. Evelyn had been paying attention. Spring planning intensified. Silas met with the builder, young Patterson, on 2 consecutive Saturdays to work through the construction sequence. The well digger from Clearwater came out to assess the upper pasture water problem and gave an estimate that was, Silas reported, aggressive but not impossible. He'd arranged to sell 3 horses animals he'd been contracted to train over the winter for a rancher in the valley south of town, and the income would cover the well and have enough left for lumber. She knew the details of his finances with a specificity that, if she'd stopped to consider it, would have told her something about what kind of conversations they'd been having. They talked about his numbers the way they talked about everything, practically, directly, without performance in either direction. He didn't hide the tight places, and he didn't dramatize them. She offered her observations when they were useful and kept them to herself when they weren't. She also, quietly and without announcement, introduced him to 2 ranching families south of Red Willow who were looking for someone reliable to take on horse-breaking contracts in the spring. She did it through the natural course of conversation, mentioning his name, his 14 years of experience, the fact that his horses were boarded at Pete's, and Pete's opinion of a man's horsemanship was the most reliable endorsement available in Red Willow. She did not tell Silas she'd done this. He found out anyway, because one of the ranching families mentioned her name when they came to talk to him, and he came into the shop on a Tuesday with a look on his face that was several things at once. The Beaumont family, he said. She kept her eyes on the fabric. They're good people. They pay on time. You sent them to me. I mentioned your name, she said. They made their own decision about whether to come talk to you. He stood there for a moment. She could feel him looking at her, even though she wasn't looking at him. You could have told me, he said. I could have, she agreed. Why didn't you? She set down the fabric and looked at him. Because I didn't want you to feel obligated to receive it graciously, she said. If you'd known I'd done it, you'd have felt like you had to thank me properly, which would have made it into a transaction. This way, it's just something that happened. He looked at her for a long moment. That's a very particular way of caring about someone, he said. Making sure they don't have to feel indebted to you for it. I just didn't want it to be complicated, she said. Evelyn, he said slowly, as if her name required more space than usual. You are the most careful person I have ever known. Is that a criticism? No, he said, it's an observation. He sat down in the wooden chair. It means you don't do things carelessly. It means that when you do something for someone, you've thought about exactly what it means and exactly what you want it to mean and exactly what you don't want it to be confused with. Means, he said, that when you stood in that south-facing spot on my land in December and told me the entrance needed to be on the east side, you'd already thought carefully about what that meant. The shop was very quiet. Yes, she said, I had. And when you came to the boarding house in February to tell me about Hargrove and the men's meeting. Yes, and the Beaumont family. Yes, she said. He leaned forward slightly in the wooden chair with his forearms on his knees and looked at her across the work table with the directness that she had learned over 5 months. Was simply how he was not performing honesty, just incapable of defaulting to anything else. I love you, he said. Not I think I love you. Not something is happening between us that feels like. Just the words, clean and undecorated, in the same tone he used to assess soil quality or describe a fence line. Like stating something that was true and had been true for a while and simply needed to be said now. Evelyn's hands were flat on the work table. She could feel the grain of the wood under her palms. I know, she said, and then, because she was not a woman who left true things unsaid when saying them was what was required, I love you too. He closed his eyes briefly. It was the only involuntary thing she'd ever seen him do. When he opened them, she held up one hand. I need you to hear something, she said. Before this goes further, I'm listening, he said. I am not easy, she said. I've told you this and you've said you understand it, but I want to be specific. I am not going to change the way I run my business, or the way I make my decisions, or the way I handle my own problems, because there is another person in my life. I am not going to become smaller because it would be more comfortable for everyone around me. I am not going to stop being who I am because love is supposed to require it. I know that, he said. You say that, she said. Most men say that at the beginning. He looked at her steadily. I've watched you for 5 months, he said. Not trying to understand you so I could eventually redirect you. Just watching because watching you is interesting, and because the woman I've been watching is the one I love. Not a quieter version, not a version I could manage more easily, he paused. I want you to be exactly who you are. I have no interest in anything less than that. She looked at him for a long moment, at the tired, honest lines of his face. At the left wrist that had healed slightly wrong, at the steady brown eyes of a man who had spent 14 years building other men's dreams and had crossed nearly 2,000 miles to find something worth building his own. All right, she said, for the 3rd time, but nothing like the other 2 times. He stood up. He came around the end of the work table, slowly, giving her the full awareness of the movement. He stopped in front of her. He reached up and touched her face, her jaw, the back of his hand against her cheek, so gentle it made something in her chest ache, and he looked at her the way she'd come to understand. Over 5 months was his version of saying everything at once. She let him. That was the thing. She let him fully and without the half measure of keeping one part of herself held back as insurance. She stood in her own shop, on her own ground, and she let someone see her completely. It was the most frightening thing she'd done since she'd loaded a wagon and driven west alone. It was also, she found, something else. Something she didn't have a single word for. That was made of several things she'd missed. Without letting herself know, she missed them being known. Being chosen. Being met with the full weight of another person who had also decided this was worth it. She stepped forward the last few inches of distance between them. March moved. The days stretched. The ice on the water barrel finally gave up and stayed given up. Young Patterson from the building crew started hauling lumber out to the Garfield land, Silas's land now, and the sound of construction began to carry on the wind some mornings when the direction was right. Red Willow noticed, as Red Willow always noticed, but the noticing had changed in character. The version that reached Evelyn through the usual channels, Margaret Holt, Clara Pettigrew, The ambient information that circulated through a small town like weather was different from the October version. Less speculative, more settled. The cowboy who'd come for Evelyn Marlowe wasn't a romantic curiosity anymore. He was a man who'd bought land, arranged contracts, talked straight to Harold Holt, and was building something real northeast of town. The story had gone from gossip to something closer to local fact. Frank Hargrove was still present in the town's social machinery, but Harold's preemptive comment at the men's meeting had done its work. The whispers about Colorado that Hargrove had tried to plant had found insufficient soil. Hargrove himself seemed to understand that the particular window he'd been working was closing, which made him quieter on the subject, if no less unpleasant in general. She went out to the land on a Saturday morning in late March, when the first genuinely warm day of the year arrived, the kind of warm that the frontier reserved for the third week of March. A single day that felt almost like an apology for winter, before winter returned briefly for one last week. The frame of the house was going up. It was the most basic possible structure at this stage: vertical posts, horizontal beams, the skeleton of something that wasn't a house yet, but had committed to becoming one. Patterson's crew had 3 men working, and the sound of hammers carried across the property in the clear, cold air. She stood at the south side of the property, in the spot with the good light. The east-facing entrance, the position of the windows she'd thought about in February mornings. The specific dimensions of a workspace designed for someone who moved large bolts of fabric around and needed doorways wide enough to accommodate them. Silas came to stand beside her. "Patterson says the main house frame will be complete by end of April," he said. "The weather holds." "It usually doesn't," she said. "No," he agreed. "But the structure will be far enough along that weather delays won't set the schedule back significantly." She looked at the south-facing spot. "I want to talk about the workshop," she said. He waited. "Separate foundation," she said. "Separate structure. Not attached to the house." "I know," he said. "We talked about that." "I want a contract," she said. "Something written." "Not because I don't trust you," she paused. "Partly because I don't trust the future in general. And partly because I've learned that important agreements shouldn't rely entirely on the goodwill of the people involved." "That's the right instinct," he said, without hesitation. "I'll have Colby draft something. I'll have it reviewed by my own counsel before I sign it." "Of course," he said. She looked at the frame of the house in the distance, at the men with hammers, at the sky above the property, which was the particular blue of a March day that had decided to be extraordinary. "There's something else," she said. He waited. "My shop on Main Street," she said. "I'm not closing it." "I know," he said. "I mean, even after. Even if I move out here permanently, I'll need to maintain the Main Street location. There are customers who can't travel 3 miles. The town business matters." "We'll figure out the logistics," he said. "Silas," she said, turning to look at him directly, "I need you to understand that I'm saying yes to this, to all of it, and I am not saying yes to any version of it that requires me to diminish what I've built." "I know that," he said. "I've always known that. I need to hear you say it specifically." He looked at her, the steady brown eyes, the slightly crooked wrist. The man who had written an east-facing entrance into a sketch without being asked. "The shop stays open," he said. "Both locations. You run your business exactly the way you've run it. The workshop out here is yours by contract to do with as you see fit. None of what you've built changes except that you'll have more room to build more of it." He paused. "And you'll have someone to come home to at the end of the day." She looked at him for a long moment. "We're going to argue," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I am not someone who smooths things over for the sake of comfort. If I think you're wrong about something, I'll say so." "Good," he said. "I'd be suspicious if you didn't." "I'm serious, Silas. So am I," he said. "I want a partner, not a mirror. I want someone who'll tell me when I'm making a mistake. I've made enough of them without that." She exhaled. She hadn't realized she was holding something until she let it go. "All right," she said. And then she surprised herself anyway. because his expression suggested he was less surprised and more simply deeply glad by reaching out and taking his hand. They stood on the south side of his land, hers eventually, in the first genuine warmth of the year, with the sounds of construction behind them, and the mountains white in the distance, and the vast frontier sky overhead doing what it always did, which was remind you that your problems and your joys were both equally small and equally significant under that particular amount of blue. She held his hand. He held hers. Neither of them said anything for a while. They didn't need to. The morning was enough. The warmth was enough. The fact of two people standing on ground they were going to build something on, together, on terms they'd both agreed to with their eyes open, that was enough, and more than enough, and different in kind from the enough she'd been settling for in the dark kitchen at 3 a.m. for 3 years. She was not a woman who cried easily. She hadn't cried since the first winter in Red Willow, when a bad week had converged with a particularly cold night, and she'd sat at the kitchen table and let it happen once, before deciding firmly that that was all the time she was giving it. She didn't cry now. But something that had been held tightly for a very long time released its grip, and the release felt in the way that the best kinds of relief do not triumphant, not dramatic, just quiet and vast and entirely finally real. She looked at the east side of the south lot, where the entrance to the workshop would be. "Tell Patterson I want to meet with him next week," she said. About the workshop specifications, Silas looked at her sideways. "Not hypothetically," she said. He turned fully toward her. Something in his face moved, not the controlled stillness she'd seen him maintain for months, but something underneath that, something that had been patient for a very long time and was only now allowing itself to exist fully in his expression. "I'll tell him," he said. The hammers kept going, the March sky held its blue. And Evelyn Marlowe, who had come west alone 3 years ago with nothing but a wagon of fabric, and the absolute conviction that she would build something that couldn't be taken from her, stood on her own terms on land that was becoming hers, with a man she'd chosen freely and completely, and felt for the first time since she'd crossed the Missouri River that she was not merely surviving the frontier. She was home in it. The letter she sent to Louisa at the end of March was the shortest one she'd written in 3 years of correspondence. "Lou, send for the children's good clothes. You're going to need them. Come as soon as the roads are clear enough for travel. Bring enough for a month, because I know you, and once you see what's been built out here, you won't want to leave in a hurry. There's going to be a wedding." Evie, she sealed it, addressed it, and handed it to the post rider on a Tuesday morning without allowing herself to second-guess the wording, which was the same method she used for all decisions she'd already made and didn't want her own brain interfering with. Post rider left. The letter went east. Evelyn went back to her shop and picked up her needle and spent the rest of the morning working on Dorothy Crane's commission and trying not to think about the fact that she'd just set something in motion that would arrive in human form in approximately 6 to 8 weeks, depending on conditions, in the shape of her younger sister, with opinions about everything. She thought about it anyway, with something that surprised her, not dread, which she'd expected, but something closer to relief. The particular relief of a woman who had been keeping a significant piece of news to herself for weeks was finally allowed to put it down somewhere. The construction on the Garfield land moved in the specific rhythm of frontier building, which was to say, it moved according to its own logic and ignored the schedule it had been given. The last week of March delivered 4 days of late winter weather that shut the site down entirely. Patterson's crew worked through what they could, but wet ground and frozen timber were non-negotiable constraints, and by the first week of April, the construction was 2 weeks behind the original estimate. Silas didn't complain about this. He showed up at the site every day regardless, did what work could be done, helped where an extra pair of hands shortened the time on a particular problem, and kept his notebook updated with the revised sequence. He treated the delay as information rather than defeat, which was, Evelyn had come to understand, simply how he processed most things. She came out to the land 3 times in April, twice on Saturdays, once on a Wednesday afternoon when her 2 o'clock appointment canceled, and the weather was the kind of mild that made staying indoors feel like a small moral failure. The house frame was completed by the second Saturday of April. It stood on the rise where Silas had pointed 7 months ago before the deed was signed. Before October had turned into November and November into everything that came after, and seeing it framed against the spring sky produced in Evelyn a sensation she hadn't anticipated. She stood at the bottom of the rise and looked at it for a long moment. It was rough, deeply rough raw timber, exposed joinery, the skeleton of something that still had months of work before it became habitable. The proportions were not elegant. The northeast corner post had a slight lean that Patterson swore would be corrected when the bracing went in. The whole thing looked, from 50 yards, like the idea of a house rather than the house itself. She found it extraordinary, not because it was beautiful, it wasn't, yet, but because she understood exactly what it represented. She had watched Silas Mercer for 7 months, and she knew with the precision of someone who paid close attention to the distance between what people said and what they actually did, how much of himself he had put into that frame. 14 years of careful saving, $700 lost to Foster and rebuilt dollar by dollar after. The left wrist that had healed wrong. Every morning he'd shown up at Harkin's lumber operation before sunset in the October cold because he needed work and he wasn't going to ask her or anyone else to bridge the gap. That frame on the rise was not a house yet, but it was 14 years of a man refusing to stop. She understood that because she had her own version of it. 800 square feet of order on Main Street that she'd built from nothing with the same refusal. 2 people who had each built something unmakeable by others, standing on shared ground. The idea of that still caught her sideways sometimes, in the quiet moments when she wasn't defending herself against it. The workshop foundation was poured the 3rd week of April. She met with Patterson twice before it happened. The first meeting was technical dimensions, door width, window placement, the structural requirements of a workspace that would carry the weight of significant fabric storage on the upper shelves. Patterson was a practical young man with no opinions about what a woman should or shouldn't need in a workspace, which Evelyn appreciated more than she expressed. The second meeting was about the east entrance. She wanted it wider than standard. Wide enough for the large fabric cart she used at the Main Street shop, which she intended to replicate at the new location. Patterson drew it twice before she was satisfied with the proportions. Silas attended both meetings. He sat to the side, contributed when he had specific knowledge that was relevant, and otherwise let her and Patterson work through the specifications without inserting himself into decisions that were hers to make. Once, when Patterson seemed uncertain about a structural question related to the roof pitch, Silas offered a technical point about load distribution that turned out to be exactly correct and saved them a round of consultation with the builder in Clearwater. After the second meeting, walking back to where the horses were tied, Evelyn said, "You knew the answer to the roof pitch question from the beginning." "I thought I knew it," Silas said. "You knew it," she said. He was quiet for a step or two. "I wanted to make sure you and Patterson had worked through everything you needed to work through before I added anything," he said. It wasn't the right moment until it was the right moment. She looked at him sideways. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. She thought, that specific thing, that is what makes you different from most men I have known. She didn't say it out loud. She thought he probably understood anyway. Louisa arrived on a Wednesday morning in the 2nd week of May. Evelyn was at the shop when she heard the stage from the south, which was how travelers arrived when they came through the Valley Connection rather than direct from the north route. She was expecting it. She'd gotten a letter from Louisa 10 days prior confirming the travel dates, but the actual arrival produced a physical reaction she hadn't predicted, something in her chest that was not quite composed and not quite not. She took off her apron, put on her coat, and walked to the stage stop. Louisa came down the steps with the specific energy of a woman who had been traveling for several days and had strong opinions about it. She was 3 years younger than Evelyn and had always carried herself with a warmth that Evelyn had sometimes, privately, envied the ease of someone who moved through the world assuming it would receive her well and was usually correct. She had their mother's dark hair and their father's laugh, and the particular quality of a woman who loved her complicated older sister without reservation and had never quite understood why that was surprising. She looked at Evelyn for approximately 1 second on the platform of the stage stop, and then she crossed the remaining distance and wrapped her arms around her older sister with the thoroughness of someone who had been wanting to do that for a long time. Evelyn stood still for a moment. Then she put her arms around Louisa and held on with the same thoroughness. "You look good," Louisa said, pulling back to look at her. "You look different. Still terrifying, but different." "You look tired," Evelyn said. "I've been on a stage for 4 days, Evie." "I know. I'm saying you look tired, not that I don't love you." Louisa laughed. It was their mother's laugh, and it landed in the middle of Main Street in Red Willow and made 2 passing miners look over with involuntary smiles. "Where is he?" Louisa said. "Working," Evelyn said. "You'll meet him tonight. Tell me everything," Louisa said, picking up the smaller of her 2 bags. "I'll tell you what you need to know," Evelyn said, picking up the larger one. "Which is not the same as everything." Louisa looked at her with shining eyes. "You're happy," she said. "Evie, you're actually happy." Evelyn paused, looked at her sister. "Yes," she said finally. "I am." Louisa made a sound that was not quite a word and put her arm through Evelyn's as they walked, which was something she'd done since she was 8 years old and had not stopped doing in the 24 years since. I'm still angry at you," Evelyn said, "for sending a man to my door without asking me first." "I know," Louisa said. "I want that on record." "Noted," Louisa said, in a tone that communicated she was not particularly concerned about the record. Silas met Louisa that evening at the eating house on Main Street, which had become, over the course of the winter, the default location for anything that required a neutral table and food. He arrived on time, which Evelyn had known he would. He'd put on the dark jacket again, the one he'd worn to their first dinner in November, and he looked, as he walked through the door, like a man who understood the weight of this particular meeting and was taking it seriously without making it solemn. Louisa looked at him for approximately 3 seconds before she looked at Evelyn with an expression that contained multitudes. Evelyn gave her a look that communicated clearly, "Do not." The dinner was not smooth. Smooth was not something Evelyn expected, or particularly wanted. Smooth was what happened when everyone performed pleasantness instead of being honest. What happened instead was better, slightly awkward in the early minutes, loosening gradually as Louisa's natural warmth worked on the room the way it always worked on rooms, and Silas answered her questions with the same directness he brought to everything. Louisa asked him about his family. He told her the parents, the orphanage, the ranches, with the same factual simplicity he'd used with Evelyn in the shop that first November evening. No performance of hardship, no minimizing either, just the facts and what he'd done with them. Louisa asked him what his intentions were, which she phrased in exactly those words, with the absolute confidence of a woman who had decided she had standing to ask. Evelyn said Louisa in a warning tone. Silas said, "No, it's a fair question," and looked at Louisa directly and said, "I intend to marry your sister, with her agreement and on terms she finds acceptable, and to spend the rest of my life making sure the things she's built keep growing and not shrinking. That's the entirety of it." Louisa turned to Evelyn. Evelyn looked at her plate. "Well," Louisa said in the voice of a woman who had spent a year worrying and had just been substantially relieved. "All right then." Later, walking Louisa back to the boarding house she was staying at Mrs. Calloway's, which amused Evelyn more than she let on. Louisa was quiet in the way she got when she was organizing her thoughts into something she intended to say. "He's the kind of man," Louisa said finally, "that you could be yourself around indefinitely." "I know," Evelyn said, Not the charming kind, the real kind. There's a difference, Evelyn said. Yes. Louisa stopped walking. They were in front of the boarding house, under the lamp that misses. Calloway kept lit until midnight for her tenants. Evie, she said. I'm sorry for sending him without asking. I know that was wrong. I know you were furious. She paused. I was scared you were going to spend the rest of your life being impressive and completely alone, and that you were going to call it freedom. Evelyn looked at her sister, at the face that was younger than hers and less guarded, and had somehow always managed, in spite of that or because of it, to see things Evelyn spent considerable energy making unseeable. It wasn't entirely wrong, Evelyn said. What you were scared of. Louisa's eyes went bright. She blinked once. Don't, Evelyn said. I'm not finished. I'm not doing anything, Louisa said in a slightly unsteady voice. You still should have asked me, Evelyn said. What would have happened if he'd been wrong? If he'd been someone who wanted to manage me, or diminish me, or make my life smaller in exchange for company? You'd have sent that to my door and called it love. I know, Louisa said quietly. You're right. He happened to be the right kind of person, Evelyn said. That's luck, Lou. That's not wisdom. I know, Louisa said again. I'm sorry. They stood under the lamp for a moment. But he was, Louisa said softly, the right kind. Yes, Evelyn said. He was. She hugged her sister again, briefer this time, the specific hug of an older sister who has said what needed saying and is now ready to be done with the emotional register of the evening. Good night, Evelyn said. Good night, Evie. Louisa went inside. Evelyn walked home in the May dark with the stars out and the first real warmth of spring in the air and the sound of the frontier settling into the particular quiet of a night that wasn't entirely cold anymore. She'd been working on the wedding dress for 3 months before she admitted that was what it was. She had started it in February, during the sleepless 3 in the morning weeks, in the back room of the shop where she kept the project she wasn't ready to discuss with anyone. She'd told herself it was an experiment in fabric. She'd ordered a bolt of cream-colored wool silk blend from the Chicago supplier in January, ostensibly to assess its suitability for formal commissions. And the question of what the fabric wanted to become had led her, with the particular inevitability of decisions you've already made before you acknowledge them, to a pattern she'd been carrying in the back of her mind for years. Not the dress she'd imagined in her 20s, before Daniel, before the Missouri River. That version had been about the dress, the grandeur of it, the statement. This pattern was different, simpler and harder to make, which was always the truth about things that were actually fine. The cream fabric worked with the light instead of against it. Silhouette was clean. The details were in the construction rather than the surface, the internal structure that made it sit exactly right, the depth of the hem, the way the collar lay. She'd finished the main body in March. The hem and the detail work she'd done in April, in the evenings, at home rather than at the shop, which meant she'd been deliberately keeping it away from the shop, where Silas sometimes sat in the wooden chair against the wall. Louisa found it on a Saturday afternoon, 4 days after she arrived. Evelyn heard her come into the back room and looked up from the detail work she was finishing on the left sleeve. Louisa stopped in the doorway. Her eyes went to the dress form immediately, the cream-colored dress on the form, the hem finished, the collar sitting exactly right, the dress that was not for any customer who had ever come through the door of the shop on Main Street. Louisa didn't say anything for a moment. Don't, Evelyn said. I haven't said a word, Louisa said. You're doing the face. I'm not doing any face, Louisa said, which was completely untrue. She came into the room slowly, the way you came into rooms that held something that mattered, and stood in front of the dress form. She reached out and touched the fabric, the way you touched things that were beautiful and someone else's, and that you were not entitled to handle carelessly. Evie, she said softly. I started it in February, Evelyn said. Before I'd said anything out loud, before I'd even admitted it to myself entirely. You made your own wedding dress, Louisa said. Of course you did. No one else was going to make it correctly, Evelyn said. Louisa turned to look at her with an expression that was laughing and crying simultaneously, which had always been one of her specific talents. "You are the most you person who has ever lived," Louisa said. "Is that a compliment?" "It is the biggest compliment I know how to give," Louisa said. Evelyn looked at the dress on the form. She'd made it alone in the evenings over 3 months, same as she'd made everything else that mattered. She'd been doing that long enough that it was simply how things worked. You made the things that mattered yourself, because no one else knew exactly what they needed to be. But she thought, looking at the dress, that what came after the making might be different. They were married on a Saturday morning in the last week of May, when the plains had come back to life after winter in the particular way of things that had survived long enough to remember how to grow. Evelyn had said she didn't want a large ceremony. She'd meant it in the sense of not wanting performance, not wanting the spectacle that sometimes grew up around weddings in small towns the way weeds grew up around fence posts. She and Silas had talked about it once in April, briefly, and had agreed on something small and honest. What they had not anticipated was Red Willow's feelings about the matter. Word had gotten out through Clara Pettigrew, who could not hold information that felt significant, and through Margaret Holt, who had told Harold, who had mentioned it at the freight office, and so on in the particular chain that connected all of Red Willow's social knowledge. And what came back through those same channels was that the town intended to be present. Not intrusively, not as performance, just present in the way that communities showed up for the things they decided mattered to them. On the morning of the wedding, Evelyn stood in the back room of her shop in the cream-colored dress she'd made herself, with Louisa doing the final buttons at the back, and she looked at her own reflection in the fitting mirror she'd hauled from Denver 3 years ago in a rented wagon. And she understood something she hadn't fully understood before. She had not come west to be alone. She had come west to be free. They were not the same thing, and she had spent 3 years treating them as though they were, because freedom had felt safer than the alternative, and the alternative had once cost her everything. She was 32 years old, and she was standing at a dress she'd made herself, and she was about to walk out to a piece of land 3 miles northeast of town and marry a man she had chosen freely and entirely. And the difference between this and what she'd feared for 3 years was so vast that she couldn't quite contain it. "Last button," Louisa said. She stepped back. In the mirror, Evelyn could see her sister's face, the full brightness of it, the relief and the love, and the particular satisfaction of someone who had done a reckless thing and been right. "Don't say it," Evelyn said. "I'm not saying anything," Louisa said. "You're thinking it." "I'm allowed to think it," Louisa said. Evelyn turned from the mirror. She picked up the small bunch of early wildflowers she'd cut that morning from the edge of the property, not elaborate, just whatever was actually blooming in May on the plains of that country, which turned out to be enough. "You look beautiful, Evie," Louisa said quietly, without theater. Evelyn looked at her sister for a moment. "Thank you for sending him," she said. Louisa pressed her lips together. Her eyes went bright. "Don't," Evelyn said. "We both have to walk out there looking like adults." "Right," Louisa said. She blinked. "Right. Yes." They gathered on the land because Evelyn had said that if she was going to do this, she was going to do it on the ground that was already hers. Not the town meeting hall, not someone else's property. Hers and Silas's, and more precisely the rise where the house was now framed and roofed and beginning to look like a house rather than the intention of one. The morning was cool and clear, the kind of May morning that hadn't decided yet whether to be spring or early summer and had settled on being the finest version of the space between. The light came in from the southeast, across the plains, and hit the rise in exactly the way it always hit the rise, which was to say generously and without apology. Silas was standing at the top of the rise when she came up the path with Louisa beside her. He was wearing a dark jacket she hadn't seen, not the one from their November dinner, something newer, and he had done something careful with his hair, and he looked like a man who was trying his best, which was the most honest and endearing version of any person she could think of. He saw her when she was still 20 yards away, The expression that crossed his face was not the composed steadiness she'd spent 7 months coming to know. It was something else, something underneath that the involuntary thing she'd seen once before, in the boarding house common room when she'd told him she loved him. His eyes closed briefly and then opened, and what was in them when they opened was more than she had words for and more than she needed words for. She walked up the rise toward him. Harold Holt had agreed to speak a few words over the ceremony, being the kind of established community member whose word carried weight. He stood to one side with his hat in his hands. Patterson's crew had knocked off work for the morning. They were present somewhere at the edges. 3 men in work clothes who had spent 6 weeks building the house going up behind the ceremony and seemed to feel they had a reasonable stake in how this turned out. Clara Pettigrew was there. She was already crying, which was simply who Clara was, and required no commentary. Art Tibbs from the freight office, a handful of the miners' wives whose alterations Evelyn had priced at half for 3 years. Old Pete from the livery, Margaret Holt beside Harold. A number of others who had drifted out from town because it was a fine May morning, and this was apparently happening, and Red Willow had decided it was the kind of thing worth walking 3 miles for. Frank Hargrove was not there. Nobody mentioned this. Nobody needed to. Evelyn reached the top of the rise. She stood in front of Silas. He was looking at her with the steady brown eyes she'd first assessed in her shop in October as the eyes of a man who didn't flinch, and she understood now what that quality actually was: not toughness, not the blankness of someone who'd learned to feel less. It was presence. He was entirely, unflinchingly present in the way that very few people manage to be. "You made the dress yourself," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. He knew. "Of course I did," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "Of course you did," he said. She held out her hand. He took it. Harold Holt spoke the words that needed to be said, simple and honest, about 2 people choosing each other with full knowledge of what they were each choosing. No poetry that didn't mean anything. No language borrowed from occasions that were about someone else. Just the plain truth of 2 people who had arrived at the same place from very different directions and decided independently and then together that this was where they were staying. When Harold asked Silas if he took Evelyn Marlowe as his wife, Silas said yes, without hesitation and with no performance of the word, as though he were confirming something that had already been true for longer than this ceremony. When Harold asked Evelyn if she took Silas Mercer as her husband, she said, "I do," and the form of the words was traditional, but the way she said them was entirely her own, deliberate and clear and final, in the way of a woman who had thought carefully about everything in her life and thought carefully about this and was not uncertain. Silas put a ring on her finger. It was a plain band, gold, which was the kind of ring she would have chosen herself and which he had known without being told. They stood on the rise in the May morning, with the half-built house behind them, and the plains spread out in all directions below, and the distant white of the mountains north and west, and they were married. The small crowd made noise that wasn't quite a cheer and wasn't quite just applause, but was something that contained both the sound of people who had watched something real happen and were glad to have seen it. Louisa was making no attempt whatsoever to manage her face. Evelyn looked at Silas. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment, because there wasn't anything left to say that the past 7 months hadn't already said more fully and honestly than any sentence either of them could construct standing on a rise in May. He kissed her. She let him. She kissed him back with the thoroughness of someone who had spent 3 years being extremely careful and was now, finally, done being careful in the particular way she'd been careful. The celebration moved to the eating house on Main Street because feeding people was a practical matter, and the eating house had the most space. Mrs. Calloway contributed pies. Margaret Holt brought 2 of her kitchen women. Someone produced a fiddle that was played better than the Christmas one. The afternoon wore on, and the food ran out and was replenished, and ran out again, and the conversation moved from one end of the long table to the other without stopping. Evelyn sat beside Silas and ate and talked, and at various points during the afternoon found herself watching the room with the particular quality of attention that came when you were aware, in real time, of something being more than you'd expected it to be. She had not expected Red Willow to come the way it came. Not the numbers nearly 40 people by mid-afternoon, but the quality of it. The ease. The specific absence of the sideways glances and the careful assessments she'd felt from this town for 3 years, when she'd been the independent businesswoman they respected but weren't sure what to do with. Today, the room felt different. Today, she was something the town understood not because she had become smaller or more conventional, but because she had added something without subtracting anything. 2 outsiders who had built something real. That was the story the town had decided. And it was, she thought, an accurate story. By evening, people had drifted away. Louisa took the children she'd brought her to, a boy of 6 and a girl of 4, who had run themselves to exhaustion on the May grass outside the eating house back to Mrs. Calloway's boarding house, and put them to bed, and returned to find Evelyn and Silas sitting on the step outside the eating house in the cooling evening air. She looked at them for a moment. They were not performing anything. They were just sitting together, Evelyn's shoulder against his arm, both of them looking at the May evening as it settled into dark. Louisa went back inside and found Clara Pettigrew and talked to her for an hour, which was the most considerate thing she could have done. Evelyn and Silas sat on the step in the dark and the quiet and the cooling air. "Ask me," she said. He looked at her. "You've been not asking me something for about 2 hours," she said. "Ask." He looked forward again. The main road of Red Willow was empty now, the lamplight from the windows making yellow patches on the ground. "Do you regret it?" he said. "Not today, the first day. Letting me stay in Red Willow instead of sending me away." She considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "I was furious," she said, "for a week. I know." "I thought you were going to be like the others," she said. "The kind who needed me to be smaller. The kind who called it love while they were doing it." "I know that too," he said quietly. "I don't regret it," she said. "Not for a single day of those 7 months, not even the angry ones. Not even the February 3 in the morning ones." He looked at her. "February 3 in the morning? I'll explain it to you eventually," she said. He accepted this in the way he accepted most things without pushing, with the patient certainty that things got said when they were ready to be said. They sat for a while. "Silas," she said. "Yeah, I need you to understand something about what you're married to," she said. Not unkindly, just directly, which was the only register she operated in. "Tell me," he said. "I'm going to make mistakes," she said. "I'm going to be wrong about things sometimes and too stubborn to see it, and you're going to have to be patient enough to say it more than once before I hear it. I'm going to work too much. I'm going to make decisions without consulting you, because I've been making every decision alone for 3 years, and that's going to take time to unlearn." She paused. "I'm going to be difficult in the specific ways I told you about, and those ways are not going to become easier just because I love you." "I know all of that," he said. "You think you know it," she said. "Living with it is different from knowing it." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the road. "I held a job I hated for 6 months because I couldn't stand the idea of admitting I'd made a wrong choice," he said. "I've made decisions without asking for help because asking felt like weakness, and those decisions have cost me things I couldn't get back. I have a temper I keep very controlled, and when it does come out, it's not pretty, and I'd rather it didn't, but it does sometimes." He paused. "I'm going to be difficult in my own ways. They're different from yours. They're still going to be there." She looked at him. "So we're both a project," she said. "Most people are," he said. "The ones worth knowing." She leaned slightly more against his arm. He put his arm around her, and she let him, and they sat in the dark step in front of the eating house in Red Willow on the night of their wedding while the town settled around them. This, she thought, was the thing she'd misunderstood for 3 years. She had believed that independence meant not needing anyone. She had built her life around that belief with the thoroughness of someone who had been genuinely hurt by the alternative and was determined not to be hurt that way again. She had been competent and self-sufficient and genuinely proud of everything she'd made, and none of that was wrong. But she had also, in the process, confused needing no one with being complete. And those were different things in the way that mattered. The way a house frame was different from a house. The way knowing you could survive alone was different from knowing what you actually wanted. What she wanted, she now understood, was not rescue. She had never needed rescue. She had needed someone strong enough and honest enough and secure enough in himself to stand beside her on her own terms, to build something next to what she'd built instead of over it, to want her as she actually was rather than as a quieter version that would have been easier to stand next to. She had needed Silas Mercer specifically, which was the kind of thing you could only say in retrospect, and only honestly. Summer came. The house became habitable by July, which was 2 months behind Patterson's original schedule, and approximately what everyone who had experience with frontier construction had privately expected. Evelyn moved her personal belongings from the house she'd rented on the south end of Main Street in 3 trips with the wagon, which was fewer trips than she'd expected because she'd been more careful about accumulation than she'd realized. The Main Street shop stayed open. She hired a young woman named Frances, recently arrived from the valley with excellent needlework and a practical mind, to manage the shop during the days she was working at the new workshop. The arrangement had a period of adjustment. Frances had opinions, which Evelyn respected, and they disagreed on 2 things in the first month, one of which Frances was right about and one of which Evelyn was right about, and they worked it out directly because Evelyn had hired her to have opinions and wasn't going to punish her for having them. The workshop on the south side of the property had its east-facing entrance and its windows positioned for the light she'd stood in that December morning and understood. It had wide doorways. It had storage shelving built to specifications she'd drafted herself. It had a work table larger than the one in the Main Street shop because she could, and because the work that came into the new workshop was different work, more complex commissions, more formal pieces, the kind of orders that required the space and light to do properly. Both locations grew. Not dramatically, this was a frontier settlement, not Denver, and growth was measured in real increments rather than in the language of ambition, but steadily, which was the kind of growth that lasted. Silas established the horse ranch through the summer and fall. The first contracted horses came to the property in August. 12 animals from the Beaumont family and 3 from the rancher south of town. He worked them with the same patience and attention he brought to everything. The upper pasture water problem had been solved by midsummer with the well the Clearwater man had dug. It was slightly over budget and exactly as functional as promised. He was good at the work. She watched him with the horses sometimes, from the window of the workshop, and understood something about him that she'd suspected from the beginning, but had confirmed slowly across months. He was not a man who performed competence. He simply was competent in the specific and unshowy way of someone who had learned things by doing them rather than by being told about them. They argued as she'd warned him they would. The first significant argument was in August, about a business decision she'd made without telling him she'd agreed to a large commission from a woman in the next valley at a price she hadn't discussed with him first, which impacted her availability for 2 weeks in a way that affected some shared logistics they'd been planning. She'd been wrong not to tell him first. She knew it before he said anything. What she hadn't been prepared for was how she'd feel about admitting it, not the admission itself, which she made cleanly and directly, but the specific vulnerability of being wrong to someone who mattered, which was different from being wrong in private. It affected the wagon schedule, Silas said. He wasn't shouting. He was doing the thing she'd learned was more challenging to respond to, speaking quietly and precisely about the actual problem. I know, she said. I made the decision, and then I didn't tell you because I'd already made it, and I didn't want to have the conversation. That's exactly the problem, he said. I know that too, she said. Silence. Next time he said, tell me first. I don't have to agree with every decision. I just need to know about them so I can work around them. All right, she said. That's it? Yes, she said. You're right, I'll do better. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that suggested he'd been prepared for a longer argument and was recalibrating. Okay, he said. Did you want it to go longer, she said. No, he said. But the corner of his mouth moved slightly. It wasn't the last argument. There were others through that first year about the workshop budget in October, about a fence line dispute with the neighboring property in November that he handled in a way she thought was too accommodating. She was right about the fence line. He acknowledged it. He'd been too accommodating because he didn't want early conflict with the neighbor, which was the kind of thing she understood even while maintaining she was right. These arguments had a specific quality she'd never experienced before. They ended, not with one person capitulating to keep the peace, but with two people actually working through the thing until they arrived at something true. That was different. She hadn't known it could be different until it was. October arrived again, the first October of their marriage, 1 year from the Tuesday afternoon when a trail-dusted stranger had walked through her shop door with his hat in both hands. She thought about that Tuesday sometimes, the way she'd looked up and assumed it was Clara Pettigrew. The 4 words that had stopped her breath, the specific stubborn curiosity that had made her let him stay in Red Willow instead of sending him away immediately, which was what the fully defended version of herself had intended to do. She thought about what it would have cost her if she'd sent him away. Not in the language of dramatic loss, she didn't think in that language, but practically. The workshop would not exist. The east-facing entrance that she'd specified, because she understood the winter snowdrift patterns, would not exist. Francis would be working for someone else. The house on the rise would belong to someone else's plans. More than that, the 3 in the morning would still be the 3 in the morning. The cold kitchen, the tea going cold, the news she had nobody to tell. She was in the workshop on an October afternoon, working on a commission that required the specific quality of afternoon light that came through the south windows at that time of year, which she had chosen deliberately, those windows. Because she had stood in this spot the previous to December and known exactly what the light did here and exactly what it was worth when she heard Silas coming across the yard. She heard him before she saw him, which was something she'd come to understand was how she knew where he was, most of the time the particular rhythm of his steps on different ground surfaces. She'd learned them without deciding to. He came to the east entrance and stopped in the doorway. He had a look on his face that was assessing and amused simultaneously. What, she said. Letter from your sister, he said. He held it up. She wrote 2 weeks ago, Evelyn said. Different one, he said. This one is about coming back in the spring. Evelyn set down the piece she was working on. Louisa coming back in the spring was either a social visit or it was Louisa having developed, over the 7 months since the wedding, new opinions about things. Both were possible. With Louisa, both were frequently simultaneous. She wants to see the workshop, Silas said. She said he looked at the letter. She said she wants to see the place Evie built that's entirely hers. He looked up from the letter. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She looked around the workshop, the east-facing entrance. The windows, the wide doorways, the shelving full of bolts of fabric from Denver and Chicago, and one from a new supplier in Cincinnati whose silk was the finest she'd found. The large work table, the commission on the board, Francis's spare needle case on the corner shelf because Francis sometimes came out to help on the complex pieces. All of it hers on ground that was also hers, next to a ranch that was his. On a piece of land they'd each brought themselves to. Tell her the spring is good, Evelyn said. Tell her the workshop will be here. Silas looked at her with the steady brown eyes she'd have known anywhere by now, in any light, at any hour. Come see something, he said. She put down the commission. She followed him out of the east entrance, across the yard, up the rise to where the house stood complete now, properly complete, with walls and windows and a porch she'd insisted on that he'd had Patterson add in September. From the top of the rise in the October afternoon, The plains spread out in every direction, and the mountains stood in the northwest, with their first winter snow on the high peaks, and the sky was the deep October blue that belonged specifically to that part of the country at that time of year. She stood beside him on the rise, the ranch below, the workshop to the south, the house behind them, the road to Red Willow visible in the distance, 3 miles of flat land between here and the town that had gossiped about them and shown up for their wedding, and continued to be exactly the complicated mixture of decent and small-minded that all towns were. 1 year ago today, Silas said. She looked at him. Approximately, he said, give or take a few days. I walked into your shop and said 4 words that you almost threw me out for. I considered it, she said. I know, he said. Your face was extremely expressive about it. My face is never expressive, she said. Your face, he said carefully, is expressive to people who pay attention to it. She looked at him. He looked at her. The October wind moved across the rise, and neither of them felt it the way they'd felt the cold in October a year ago, which was the kind of change that happened, so gradually you only noticed it when something made you measure. What she understood now, standing on her own ground in the second October of her life in Red Willow, was something she'd been working toward for a year and had finally arrived at enough to say plainly. She had never needed someone to make her whole. Louisa had been wrong about that part, or at least imprecise. She had been whole. She had built a whole life with whole decisions, and she had been, in all the ways that mattered functionally, complete. What she had needed, what she had been missing, in the dark kitchen at 3 a.m, in the evenings when something good had happened and she had no one to tell it to, was not completion. It was witness, someone to stand beside her on the ground she'd built and see it with her. Someone who understood what it had cost and didn't need to be told why it mattered. Someone strong enough and honest enough and whole enough in himself that standing beside her didn't require either of them to become smaller. She had found that. She had chosen it, on her own terms, with her eyes entirely open. Plains spread out. The mountains held their white. The October sky was as blue as it had ever been. Evelyn Marlowe, Evelyn Mercer now. Though she used both names depending on the context, and Silas had not suggested this required any explanation, stood on the rise beside the man she'd married and looked at everything they'd built and felt something she recognized now. Clearly and without surprise, as the specific gravity of a life that fit. Not a perfect life, not a smooth one, not the life she'd imagined when she was young and didn't yet know what she was imagining. The real one. The one with arguments and debt and sleepless nights and difficult customers and a fence line dispute that wasn't fully resolved and a workshop she'd built from scratch and a sister who would arrive in the spring full of opinions and a man beside. Her who had crossed nearly 2,000 miles, knowing she might immediately send him away. She hadn't sent him away. She had understood in some part of herself that operated below the defended logic of a woman who had decided she needed nothing, that the man in her doorway with his hat in both hands was different from what she feared. She hadn't known how yet. She hadn't been able to prove it. But she'd let him stay, and she'd found out. And Red Willow, that small and complicated and occasionally infuriating frontier town surrounded by unforgiving plains and rugged mountains, had been the right place to find out because it had asked something real of her. And she had given something real back, and the ground she stood on was proof of it. She reached out without looking and found his hand. He took it the way he always took it, without ceremony, without making it into more than it was, which was simply 2 people choosing, for another day, to stand in the same place. The wandering was over. Red Willow was home, and home, she now understood, was not the absence of difficulty or the end of becoming. It was not a condition you arrived at and then preserved in amber. It was the place where the people and the ground and the work were real enough to be worth fighting for, failing at, improving, returning to. It was this. Exactly this. She held his hand on the rise in the October afternoon, and the plains went on forever, and that was enough, more than enough, and it always had been.